region are ahead. As a large public company,
If we can everybody go to their seats, we're going to go ahead and get started here in the next minute or two. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could take your seats, appreciate it. Well, good morning, everybody. Have you take your seats. Thank you, Vince. Well, great. Good morning, everybody. I'm Russell Mills, the Senior Director of the Center for Regional Development at BGSU. On behalf of of the team at CRD and all of us at Bowling Green State University, I'd like to welcome you to the 20th Annual State of the Region Conference. I'm sorry we didn't have this conference Saturday or Sunday when it was 70 degrees and sunny, but I suspect there would be far less of you here today than there is on this rainy and cold Monday morning. So it's great to be back all in person with all of you and I'll see most of your faces, I guess. Some of you are great to see in person. So I'd like to, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most difficult and challenging times for our country, given the number of our friends and neighbors we lost and the dramatic impact on our regional and local economies. But one of the great things that did emerge from the pandemic was our ability to adapt and to use technologies that, if used properly, can result in more inclusivity. One example of that is today's State of the Region. Following our virtual event that we did last year on Zoom, we decided to stream all future State of the conferences in order to make our event accessible to our partners that work in Washington, D.C., Columbus, and places that may be a little bit further of a drive away, given how early we have the. So I'd like to thank Vince and our great public TV station, WBGU, and Tom and their crew for making that possible today. So this year's State of the Region conference is titled Catalyzing Workforce Development Through Transformative Placemaking. One of the most profound impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is a dramatic reevaluation of the priorities of working Americans. Many Americans use the COVID-19 pandemic as a time to reflect on the importance of work in relationship to their families, health, hobbies, and personal pursuits. As a result, many Americans retired, chose part-time work over full-time work, many cases providing childcare, or upskilled to move from a service industry job that interacted with the public routinely to a professional services profession. Relatedly, the COVID-19 pandemic offered Americans an opportunity for a reset, not only in terms of their careers, but on also where they choose to live. As we've seen in many things, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated an important trend, namely, increasingly workers, and in particular younger workers, are selecting places where they want to live and quality of life amenities before they decide on a specific job or occupation. The rise of remote work during the pandemic has also significantly contributed to this phenomenon. This is a significant paradigm shift, particularly for regions like Northwest Ohio, where we focused on economic development traditionally through the lens of job attraction. The framework of attract the jobs and they will follow is no longer a sustainable model. Regions and communities must work to develop attractive, accessible, and inclusive private and public places and spaces that increase quality of life for existing residents while attracting new residents. At the same time, communities must develop a social environment that is reflective of community identity and history. This is a challenge both for urban and rural communities across our region. So recognizing this, our team at BGSU and the Center for Regional Development created the Reimagining Rural Regions Initiative, or R3, which I think most of you have heard about at this point. The idea of R3 is really to engage in transformative placemaking planning processes in rural communities across Northwest Ohio and work with community members and BGSU students to implement projects and initiatives to make our communities more vibrant, inclusive, sustainable places to live. The R3 initiative is funded by grants from the EDA and also the USDA Rural Development Placemaking Innovation Challenge. The first cohort of R3 communities, the city of Marysville, the city of Van Wert, and the village of Gibsonburg, are currently developing placemaking plans with assistance from our staff at CRD, and will work with teams of our BGSU students known as PACE Fellows this summer to begin implementing placemaking projects and initiatives. I'm happy to announce the application period for the second cohort of R3 communities opens today. We posted on the website this morning and runs through April 15th. So if your community is interested, please contact us. We'll be having a webinar here later in March to select the next 3 communities for the second cohort. Today we hear from one of the nation's foremost thought leaders, Jennifer Vey from Brookings Metro, on the importance of transformative placemaking and how Northwest Ohio can learn from the experiences of other communities across the U.S. Additionally, we will have a wonderful panel of experts who are leading placemaking efforts in our communities across Northwest Ohio. First, there's several people I'd like to thank and recognize. First, our partners at EDA, and Alan Hines, in particular, our Ohio Economic Development Representative, who's been great to work with over the past 18 months during some challenging times. And so, Ellen, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our partners at USDA Rural Development for their support of the R3 initiative through the Rural Innovation Challenge. I look forward to expanding our relationship over the next 2 years to work on this project together. I'd also like to thank representatives from our federal delegation who are in attendance, so Senator Sherrod Brown, Senator Rob Portman, Representative Marcy Kaptur, and Representative Bob Latta. Thank you for your service to our nation. I'd also like to thank representatives from Governor Mike DeWine's office and Lieutenant Governor John Husted's office who are in attendance. Again, thank you for your service to the state of Ohio. Then I'd like to recognize also Chancellor Gardner, who I saw here this morning, who, in the time I've known him and been at BGSU, has been a tireless advocate for higher education, not only in Northwest Ohio, but across the state of Ohio. So, Chancellor Gardner, thank you very much for attending today. And finally, we have members or staff of several folks from the Ohio Senate and Ohio House in attendance. Senator McCauley, who you'll be hearing from here shortly, Senator Teresa Gavarone, Representative Haraz Ganbari, Representative Michael Sheehy, and Representative Paula Hicks Hudson. So I'd like to thank each of you for your service to the state of Ohio and your support of the Rural Universities Program, which helps provide funding for CRD to host the State of the Region Conference. I'd like to recognize our many sponsors for this year's event as well. I'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, the Regional Growth Partnership and the Toledo Regional Chamber of Commerce. Our gold sponsors, the Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority, the City of Toledo, and Wood County Economic Development for their support, not only to the state of the region, but to their commitment to our regional SEDS effort. Then I'd like to thank our silver sponsors, Eastman and Smith, Ohio Concrete, Mosier, and Connect Toledo of the 20th Annual State of the Region. Finally, I'd like to thank my staff, and in particular, Demi Hikes. If you know Demi, this is her event. I just get up here and talk. So Demi's really the glue on our team that holds us together, and so if you see Demi, make sure you tell her thank you and a great job as usual. I'd also like to thank Vijaya Desiki, who's out in the lobby as well, who's helped us with a lot of the logistics with the hotel and getting ready for the event. And then before Coda, who's one of our amazingly talented graduate students, who will, all the graphs that I present later, before really designs all those. So if you're looking for a data analytics person, he's a PhD. He would be a great addition to any of your teams here in Northwest Ohio. Finally, I'd like to thank the rest of our CRDs team for their assistance, including Nicole Pfeiffer, Ben Hooper, Maddie Georgioff-Menick, and Lisa Lawson, and our exceptional team of graduate students, many of whom will be working for your here in the upcoming years, I hope. Keep them here in Toledo. So finally, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Roddy Rogers. He can't be with us today. He's going to be joining virtually, but he pre-taped a great video, which I think is really amazing. So Roddy's the 12th president of Bowling Green State University. BGSU, as many of you know, is a public university that embraces its responsibility to act in the public interest and create public good. That mission and vision is best exemplified by our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and our president. I'm pleased to welcome President Rogers to the virtual stage.
Thanks, Russ, and good morning, everyone. I wish I could join you at today's annual State of the Region Conference hosted by our Center for Regional Development. However, I would like to take a moment to add my welcome as we kick off today. For 20 years now, this conference brings our community, regional and statewide leaders together to focus on our region and share strategies and best practices to drive the economic vitality of Northwest Ohio. From elected officials, business and nonprofit leaders, and economic development professionals, we share a mission, a common mission, to ensure the best days for our region are ahead. As a large, public, comprehensive, high-research university, we recognize and embrace our commitment to create public good. And we all share that mission, to do good. This year's conference theme is on workforce development and transformative placemaking. And I am struck just how relevant it is to understand the importance of the quality of life and place in attracting and retaining talent in our region. This builds upon BGSU's Reimagining Rural Regions initiative, which focuses on enhancing the assets of rural communities across Northwest Ohio through the center and through our students. Today, you also will be hearing from Senator Rob McCauley, who has been serving in the Ohio Senate since 2017 and represents Ohio's 1st District. I want to especially add my thanks for his comments and for his leadership as chairman of the Senate Energy and Public Utilities Committee. I also note that prior to that, Senator McCauley also served in the Ohio House of Representatives along with the Community Improvement Corporation of Henry County. Between today's keynote, panel discussions, and sessions, this conference moves us forward. It showcases the power of the talent in Ohio, and it illuminates the opportunity to create public good, the opportunity we will continue to strive to meet together. Thank you.
Welcome Senator Rob McCauley to the stage to give some opening remarks. Senator McCauley.
Thank you, President Rogers. Thank you, Russ. I appreciate it. It's great to be in this room. As he mentioned, I know many of you from my previous experience in economic development at the Henry County CIC, so it's good to see a lot of familiar faces. I want to talk a little bit today about challenges and opportunities. You know, certainly we've seen over the past several years a number of challenges that we've all had to go through, a number of challenges that we've seen both globally, regionally, and locally. Namely among them is on display today, the fact that BGSU had a challenge in finding somebody to give opening remarks. They asked 12 people before me, and now you get to end up with me. So it's an opportunity for me to speak to all of you, unfortunately for all of you. So with that, I mean, let's talk a little bit about it. Let's talk a little bit about how things have changed, and Russ mentioned it in his opening remarks. The fact that we were put into and forced into an environment where we were taken out of our comfort zones. We were taken out of many of our traditional norms as far as the face of work. We were taken out of many of our traditional norms and what we thought of the global economy and the global supply chain. We were taken out of many of our norms as we thought right now, as we're seeing across the world, the way that our geopolitics works and how that's impacting things. But one thing we've learned over the past several years is that in many cases, those challenges present opportunities for us to showcase our strengths and our advantages. And I think if you look at Northwest Ohio and the state of Ohio in general, we are ideally suited to showcase our advantages and our strengths. Let's highlight first off, many of you have, I'm sure, heard about it, the Intel deal. Bringing Intel and their $20 billion investment with the potential to be a $100 billion investment to the state of Ohio is no small feat. But it's also a reflection of Ohio's strengths. It's a reflection of the fact that on the state level, we are doing what we can to make Ohio a more business-friendly state. It's a reflection that we have low energy costs relative to many of our competitors. It's a reflection that we have excellent higher education institutions in the state of Ohio. But that would not arguably have come about had we not seen many of the challenges on the national scale and international scale that we've gone through over the last 2 years. When you think of semiconductor and chip manufacturing, you don't necessarily think of the United States anymore. But you look at what has happened and what brought that deal to the state of Ohio, and it was a changing landscape on the globe, and Ohio was ready to respond to that changing landscape. But it's not going to stop there. Some of you may be sick of hearing about the Intel deal, but I can tell you you shouldn't be, because there's going to be a ripple effect felt statewide of companies that are going to look to the state of Ohio to do business. Companies that already realize if it's good enough for Intel, then it's good enough for us. I can promise you there are already companies in the technology field in particular that are already looking at the state of Ohio as a potential for investment. Companies that 2 or 3 years ago would not have even looked at the United States as a potential for investment. Companies that are in parts of the world that are worried right now about what their long-term future looks like in that part of the world. And Ohio has what they need in order to succeed. Ohio has, like I mentioned before, relatively low cost of energy. We have an abundant supply of water. And here in Northwest Ohio, arguably better than any other part of the state, we have the crossroads of America with I-75 and I-80 and I-90 coming right through Northwest Ohio. And you mix that with some of the other advantages that we have in Northwest Ohio, is primed to take advantage of many of the challenges that we're facing on a global scale. We've also seen the changing face of work. We've seen people who now can work from anywhere they want in the entire country, regardless of where their employer is located. We've seen people who have gone from working in law firms in big cities who are now moving out to small towns to live and raise their family. We've seen people who've gone and moved from huge metropolises and decided that's not the life for me. I would rather have a lower cost of living and a better standard of life. What better place to capitalize on that than Northwest Ohio? And we're already seeing it, where we're seeing public and private partnerships being leveraged across the region to turn in great efforts at creating a better for these people to live and raise their family. From the investment in the partnerships in the city of Toledo with ProMedica, down to Findlay with the investment in partnerships with the Marathon Petroleum Corporation and the local elected officials down there, which shout out to Findlay, eighth time in a row, top micropolitan in the U.S. Let's give them a round of applause. Tim Miley, I kept track of everybody who didn't clap. You got some haters in the room. We have great other examples. Van Wert was mentioned as a community that's taking a very active role in trying to create what people want in the 21st century, trying to create what they want in their community. We have what we need to accomplish all of these goals. We have what we need to capitalize on these challenges and turn them into opportunities. The question becomes, will the people in this room, in large part, the holders and the shepherds of our economic future in Northwest Ohio, will the people in this room take those challenges and turn them into opportunities? And I have great faith that all of you will. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you very much, Senator McCauley, for those great opening remarks. Next, I have the privilege to introduce the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Toledo Regional Chamber of Commerce, Wendy Gremza, to the stage to introduce our first presenter. Wendy, again, thanks for sponsoring our State of the Region and also for being such a great partner on pretty much everything we work on. So thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Russ. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here in person, again, to see everyone. Loved seeing everyone on Zoom, but it's much better to see everyone in person. So very happy to be here, and the Chamber is extremely grateful and happy to be a sponsor of this great event. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Abby Omodumbi. He is Assistant Vice President and Senior Economist for PNC Financial Services Group. In this role, he is responsible for contributing to PNC's regional, national, and international economic analyses and forecasts, including coverage of metropolitan area economies throughout PNC's footprint. In addition, he also speaks frequently about the economy of PNC clients and regional media. Prior to joining PNC in October of 2018, he spent 3 years in risk management at Goldman Sachs in New York. He also worked as a summer research fellow at the Conference Board, also in New York. Abby earned his PhD in economics from State University of New York with concentrations in labor economics and econometrics. He also has a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Please help me in welcoming our speaker, Abby Omodumbi.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be in Perrysburg, Ohio. I had told Wendy that if she mispronounced my last name, she will need to pay a fee. Yeah, so I accept Bitcoin, so we can discuss that after. Yeah. So the U.S. economy has made a strong recovery from the viral recession. Risks are weighted to the downside. The biggest risk is the Russia-Ukraine crisis. There are other risks, but I still expect a very strong 2022. So before I go into the brass tacks, before I go into the details of my presentation, I'd like to give you the main points. First, consumer spending, inventory accumulation, and business investment will drive the U.S. economy this year. Also expecting inflationary pressures to moderate this year. PNC Economics expects slower house price growth in 2022. Energy prices are going to increase in the near term, but they should stabilize by the middle of this year. We're also expecting 5 Fed rate hikes this year. We expect the first one to be in 2 weeks. The Fed's going to meet on March 16th. And finally, we're going to see some structural changes being accelerated due to the pandemic. So we're going to see changes in the retail sector, changes in commercial real estate, and changes in supply chain networks. So before the viral recession started, consumer in great shape. The labor market was in excellent shape. The unemployment rate was close to the record low rate. And consumers felt very positive about the U.S. economy. This chart shows you the year-over-year change in real median household income. There are a couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to. This chart goes as far back as 1976. First, in 2008, you can see the decline due to the Great Recession. But from around 2014, we started seeing strong year-over-year increases in real median household income. It was the longest expansion on record. Many consumers were feeling the benefits of the expansion. And then we had the viral recession in spring of 2020. This was an exogenous event, and that's resulted in about a 3% year-over-year decline in real median household income. So consumers felt very good about the economy before the viral recession. Business debt was more of a concern. There was a boom in bond markets, so many businesses took advantage of very low interest rates. And corporate debt was, sorry, I'm trying to go back. Okay, corporate debt was very high as a percentage of GDP. So that's the blue line. So corporate debt had been increasing because interest rates were very low. A couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to. First, in spring 2020, the U.S. government and Congress implemented substantial fiscal stimulus measures to support the U.S. economy, and we saw a steep increase in corporate debt due to the PPP programs, the Paycheck Protection Programs. We've seen a decline in corporate debt levels recently, but it's still very high compared to where it's been since 1960. So while the debt level is concerning, businesses are able to make interest payments as a small percentage of their cash flow. So interest payments are very low as a percentage of cash flow. That's the orange line. So business debt levels are high, but businesses are still doing very well. Profits are very solid, and businesses are taking advantage of the very low interest rates. And then we had the viral recession in spring of 2020. It changed our lives forever. We saw a sharp decline in economic outputs. The U.S. economy lost about 10% in 2 months. This was the sharpest contraction since World War II. Compare that with, sorry, I keep going too fast. So we lost 10% in 2 months of 2020. Compare that with the Great Recession, where we lost about 4% in about 1.5 years. Also compare the recovery, it was an extremely sharp recovery. So it took us about a year to return back to the pre-crisis level. During the Great Recession, it took us about 3 years to return to the pre-Great Recession level. So it's been broadly a very strong economic recovery, and we're now about 4% above the pre-crisis level. So just looking at GDP and gross domestic income and final sales of domestic products, it's been a very sharp recovery. So while it's been broadly a sharp recovery, it's been very uneven. It's been very uneven on a global scale. There are many countries that are performing much better than the US. There's some that are performing worse than the US. It's been uneven in terms of socioeconomic class. Minimum wage workers and lower income workers felt the brunt of the pandemic. So folks that work in restaurants, in travel, in retail, they bore the brunt of the viral recession. It's also been uneven in terms of the sectors of the US economy. This chart shows you the recovery of various sectors of the US economy. I'm just going to talk about a few sectors. So the viral recession was, by and large, a service sector recession. As I mentioned earlier, the folks that work in retail, in travel, in leisure and hospitality, they bore the brunt of the recession. And we saw about a 15% decline in spending on consumer services in the first half of 2020. So the blue line shows you the change from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020. This is the period where we had the recession. So spending on consumer services declined by about 15% during that period. We've made a strong recovery so far, but we're still about 1% below the pre-crisis level. This second category, spending on consumer durables, this describes a lot of what's going on in the US economy today. It explains the supply chain disruptions. It also explains the inflation. So in spring 2020, a lot of folks didn't feel comfortable venturing out. Folks weren't traveling. So we spent a lot of time buying goods. So there's been a strong demand for consumer durables. So folks spend time on Amazon, on Etsy, folks bought Pelotons. And now spending on consumer durables is about 20% above the pre-crisis level. This explains the supply chain disruptions. There's been a turbocharged demand for consumer goods, and the supply side hasn't been able to keep up with it. So we're seeing shipping delays. We're seeing a shortage of truck workers. We're seeing delays at ports. And producers have just not been able to meet up with the turbocharged demand. And that's why we're seeing the supply chain disruptions which has been a recurring theme in the U.S. economy in the past 2 years. This also explains the inflation. Whenever demand exceeds supply, we see an increase in prices. So there's been, again, a very strong demand for goods, which has caused there to be an increase in prices in the past couple of years. Towards the end of 2021, we've been seeing broadening effects of inflation. So we've been seeing inflation from goods into services. So inflation is being more broad spread now. It's going away from goods, and we're now seeing more inflation in the service sector. Exports. Our recession was by and large a global recession. The US went through a recession, China went through a recession, Brazil did, India did, you name it. Most economies went through a recession. And with that being said, American exports were challenged. So exports declined by about 25% in the first half of 2020. As the global economy has improved, we've seen an improvement in exports, but we're still about 5% below the pre-crisis level. Finally, after-tax personal income. Usually during a recession, declines in incomes. During the viral recession, we saw the opposite. We saw a strong increase in incomes due to the substantial fiscal stimulus measures from Congress. So consumers got 3 sets of checks. There were extended and expanded unemployment benefits. Businesses also benefited from the Paycheck Protection Program, particularly small and mid-sized businesses. And we saw a strong increase in after-tax personal income in the first half of 2020. As consumers have felt comfortable venturing out and as restrictions have been lifted, we've seen a decline in after-tax personal income, but we're still about 3% above the pre-crisis level. So this is very supportive of economic growth this year. So looking ahead in 2022, I'm very optimistic about the U.S. economy. Again, there are downside risks to the outlook, but consumers are in excellent shape. Consumer spending makes up about 2/3 of GDP. Spending on services makes up about 50% of GDP. And consumers saved up so much money in the past couple of years. When we had lockdowns and, as folks didn't feel comfortable traveling or going out, we ended up saving up a lot of money. Consumers saved up an extra $2 trillion during the pandemic. And consumer balance sheets are very solid. This chart shows you the financial obligations ratio and also the savings rate. As you can see, the financial obligations ratio is at a very low level compared to where it's been since 2005. The financial obligations ratio is the percentage of your obligations based on your disposable personal income, so your rent, your mortgage, your students, all those obligations as a percentage of your after-tax personal income. So consumers have a lot of room to spend because obligation ratios are very low compared to where they've been historically. We also saw an increase in the personal savings rates during the past couple of years. The saving rates has declined in recent months, but it's still very supportive of economic growth. So consumers are very well positioned to support the U.S. economy this year. So we think consumers are going to drive the U.S. economy this year. Now, inflation has been one of the recurring themes in the past couple of years. We've been seeing the highest inflation readings since the 1980s. Folks are feeling inflationary pressures at the gas pump, in grocery stores. Businesses are feeling inflation. It's more expensive to build a house now. We're seeing lumber prices surge at a very high rate. And also, the Russia-Ukraine crisis adds to inflationary pressures in the near term. The Russia-Ukraine crisis will likely cause there to be higher energy prices in the near term, and this is going to feed into inflation. But we expect inflation to moderate in the second half of this year. As the Fed increases its policy rates, the Fed's funds rate, We're calling for 5 increases this year, with the first one on March 16 when the FOMC meets. As the Fed increases its policy rates and as the Fed stops quantitative easing. So quantitative easing is a program whereby the Fed buys assets to support the U.S. economy. As the labor market and the overall economy has improved so far, the Fed is going to stop QE in March. And also the Fed is going to potentially start selling off the assets from its balance sheet this year. All those monetary policy measures are going to help tame inflation. So as the Fed implements its monetary policy tools and supply chains normalize, we're expecting much better inflation readings in the second half of this year. Now, I think it's very likely that we have another regime of high inflation like the 70s and the 80s. Again, the Fed has adequate tools in order to address high inflation, and as supply chains normalize, that's also going to help tame inflation. So we're calling for much better inflation readings towards the second half of this year. We're likely going to see higher inflation numbers in the near term due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the impact that's going to have on energy prices. But towards around the second half of this year, I expect to see much better inflation numbers. With that being said, the risks to the inflation outlook are tilted towards higher inflation. This chart shows you the year-over-year change in labor costs. So labor costs are the cost of 1 unit of output. And just looking at the blue line, you can see we've been experiencing some of the highest labor costs in decades. So we've been seeing the highest year-over-year change since 2006. This could put upward pressures on inflation in 2022. Another risk to inflation is from housing. So shelter costs makes up about a third of CPI, and we've been seeing very strong increases in house prices in the past couple of years. That's likely going to feed into inflation this year too, which could cause there to be higher inflation numbers. This chart shows you the Case-Shiller index, the year-over-year change. As you can see, we've been seeing very strong increases on a year-over-year basis. We saw a decline in late 2021, and we still expect there to be house price growth this year, but it's going to be slower than what we've seen in previous years. Now, one of the reasons why we're going to see slower house price growth is that we're going to see mortgage rates increase this year. Mortgage rates declined to around below 3% in early 2020. The trend for this year is for higher mortgage rates, and that's going to soften the demand for housing, which is going to cause there to be slower house price growth in 2022. Also, in 2022, we expect that we're going to see the 10-year Treasury yield increase. This chart shows you the 3-month Treasury bill, which tracks the Fed's funds rates, and the 10-year Treasury bond yield, which correlates with mortgage rates. We're going to see an increase in the 3-month Treasury bill as the Fed increases interest rates. Again, we're calling for 5 Fed rate increases this year. We're also going to see the 10-year Treasury yield increase this year. In the short term, it's going to decrease due to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Whenever there are geopolitical risks, many investors usually buy U.S. bonds, which usually causes there to be an increase in the bond prices and then a decline in the yields. So in the near term, we're going to see lower 10-year yields, but over the course of 2022, I expect 10-year yields to increase. We're calling for the 10-year yield to end this year at around 2%. Another tool which the Fed is going to implement to help tame inflation is quantitative tightening. So this is when the Fed sells assets from its balance sheet. This chart shows you the Fed's balance sheet since 2005. Quantitative easing is a tool which was started by the Fed after the Great Recession. As you can see, we saw a jump in the Fed's balance sheet in 2008. This was when the Fed was trying to support the U.S. economy during the Great Recession. We also saw another jump in 2020 due to the pandemic. The Fed and Congress, they pulled out all the stops to support the U.S. economy. As the economy improves and as the Fed feels more comfortable with its dual mandates, the Fed is going to start reducing its balance sheet this year. Now, the Fed has only done this once, so we don't really have a lot of precedent to tell you to say when the Fed is going to start doing it or how the Fed is going to do it. But our forecast is that from around June, July, once the Fed has started increasing interest rates, the Fed would then start taking steps to reduce its balance sheet. I'm just going to go over the main points again. I expect consumer spending, inventory accumulation, and business investment to support the U.S. economy this year. The inflationary pressures which businesses and consumers have been feeling will moderate by the second half of this year. PNC Economics is calling for slower house price growth. We're going to see an increase in mortgage rates, which is going to soften the demand for housing. Energy prices are going to rise in the near term. The Russia-Ukraine crisis is going to be one of the biggest factors affecting the energy markets in the near term. But we expect to see moderation by the second half of this year. PNC Economics is calling for 5 hikes. The first one is going to be in March 16. 2 weeks. We're calling for 5 25 basis point hikes this year and 3 additional hikes next year. So the terminal range is going to be between 2 and 2.25%. Finally, we're going to see structural changes being accelerated due to the pandemic. We're going to see structural changes in retail. So the Amazon effect is going to be accelerated. The Amazon effect is the decline in brick and mortar stores and an increase in online retail. The pandemic is going to accelerate that trend. We're going to see changes in the commercial real estate sector. The pandemic has increased remote work. A lot of folks have been working from home for the past couple of years. And this is going to cause there to be a decline for demand of commercial real estate. Many downtown areas all over the country have pretty much empty office spaces right now because folks are working from home. So we're going to see that trend continue in the medium term, a decline in commercial real estate. And finally, we're also going to see changes to supply chain networks. We're going to see onshoring. Folks are going to diversify their supply chain networks. And we expect this trend to continue in the long term. So finally, what are the risks to the outlook? The biggest risk to the U.S. economy and the global economy now is the Russia-Ukraine crisis. The direct impacts will be felt from rising energy prices. We've seen Brent crude oil and also Western Texas Intermediate. These are grades of crude oil. We've seen those increase to the highest levels in decades in recent days. But while the energy prices will be a shock to American consumers, consumers are able to absorb the shock. As I mentioned earlier, consumers saved up over $2 trillion extra during the pandemic. Consumers are also going to benefit from very strong wage growth in the job market. It's a very tight labor market, meaning there are more jobs than there are potential workers. So consumers are able to absorb the shock from rising energy prices. And also finally, consumers spend only about 4% of their total spending budgets on gasoline and energy. So, it's a small share of all the spending we do. So there will be a shock in the near term, but consumers are able to absorb it. Another risk to the outlook is from monetary policy. If the Fed increases interest rates too aggressively, that could spook markets and spook consumers and potentially cause there to be a decline in consumer spending, which could tip the U.S. economy into a recession. The Russia-Ukraine crisis complicates the Fed's job. Before the crisis, the Fed was mainly concerned with inflation. Now the Fed is concerned with inflation and growth. Again, as I mentioned, it's a big downside risk to global economic growth, and it's just really makes the Fed's job tougher. So the Fed increasing interest rates and the pace at which it increases interest rates, that could be a risk to the outlook if the Fed misses the timing and doesn't increase interest rates at in an optimal way. The stock market is also a downside risk. If we see a 20% correction in the stock market, this could affect consumer sentiment and cause there to be a decline in consumer spending. We've seen a lot of volatility in the stock markets in recent weeks, but we're still much higher than we were compared to the pre-pandemic level. So equity markets are still very high compared to where they were at pre-pandemic level. 401ks and brokerage accounts have made very healthy gains in the past couple of years. If there is a substantial correction, this could affect consumer sentiment and cause there to be a decline in consumer spending. So that's a downside risk. Commercial construction. As I mentioned earlier, we expect there to be a decline in demand for commercial real estate due to the Amazon effect and also the increase in remote work. That's a downside risk to the U.S. economy. China and emerging economies is a downside risk. China was one of the first economies to recover from the viral recession. China is a single-party system, so they're able to shut down the economy and also open it up in a very efficient manner. We've seen some slowing in economic activity in China in the past year. The real estate sector in China has been dragging the Chinese economy. If we continue to see weakening in the Chinese economy, it's a downside risk to the U.S. economy. It's also a downside risk to the global economy. Finally, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is an upside risk. If an infrastructure bill is passed, this means there'll be more jobs. It means that more bridges and roads are going to be built. This is positive for the U.S. economy. So that's an risk. But overall, the risks are weighted to the downside. But again, consumers are very well positioned to drive the U.S. economy in 2022. With that being said, I'm happy to take any questions. Yep. Good morning. That's a great point. So the Fed so the question is, if the Fed wasn't able to reduce its balance sheet to the pre-Great Recession level during the Great Recession, what makes me feel like they're going to be able to reduce it back to the pre-pandemic level during the viral recession? So as you can see this jump here, the Fed was never able to take it back to the pre-crisis level. So here's my response. The Fed actually started reducing its balance sheet after the Great Recession, but they weren't able to reduce it back to the pre-Great Recession level. I think, it's going to take the Fed a very, very long time for it to return its balance sheet to the pre-viral recession level. So the Fed will start QT by the middle of this year, but it's going to take a very, very long time because we've seen some structural changes in the way monetary policy is being applied. The terminal Fed's funds rate now is much lower now than it used to be in the 70s and the 60s. So the Fed is going to, it's going to take the Fed a very long time in order for it to reduce it back to its pre-viral recession level. Does that answer your question? Okay, we'll see. Yeah. Sure. Any other questions?
I have a question. How do you see you said that you thought the supply chain issues would ease. How do you see that happening when labor is still such a big key factor?
All right. So I do expect supply chains disruptions to improve this year, but the labor force recovery remains a big concern. We've seen a shortage in workers. It's a very tight labor market. We've seen a record high number of quits and openings in recent months. But with the tight labor market, there's also going to be very strong wage growth, right? Because employers are going to have to attract workers, and they're going to have to increase wages in order to attract workers. So I expect there to be an improvement in the labor force this year. So the increase in wages is going to bring more workers into the labor force. But the labor force is actually one of the areas of the U.S. economy where I'm least optimistic about. I think people's views about work has changed. I think that people have found ways to be more productive during the pandemic. A lot of folks who are working remotely have actually found out that they're more productive working remotely than in the office. I think that there's going to be a slow recovery of the labor force. It's going to take a couple of years before the labor force returns to the pre-pandemic level. But to answer your question directly, the strong wage growth is going to attract workers into the labor force this year. The Russia-Ukraine crisis actually poses risks to the recovery of supply chains. It was exactly what supply chain networks did not need at this point. But we do expect there to be some improvements over the course of 2022. It's not going to get back to the pre-crisis level by the end of 2022, but there will be some substantial improvement by the end of 2022. Any other questions? Sure.
Thank you very much, Abby. Well, I'm going to build off Abby's presentation today by taking a deep dive into the labor markets, both the short-term and more systemic long-term factors that are contributing to the tightest labor market that many of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. I'll then take a deep dive into our region's economic performance, the maps that most of you are used to if you come to this every year. And then finally, we'll look at sort of some demographic and workforce trends in Northwest Ohio. And then finally, I'm going to set the stage for our keynote from Jennifer Vey and also our placemaking panel by talking about some quality of life measures here in Northwest Ohio and sort of where we stand in comparison to other states or other regions around the country. Oh, and I don't have my clicker, Vince. I just noticed that. Abby, do you have the clicker? I realized you took it. I thought it was sitting up here. I didn't realize he took it. Okay. So before we begin, any professor or any time you give one of these, you have to sort of give okay, where's all this data coming from? Don't take me at my word, right? So most of the information that I'm going to share today comes from publicly available data sources. So labor statistics, the U.S. Census, the American Community Survey, Bureau of Economic Analysis, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and Atlanta, and also our Ohio Labor Market Information, or LMI. Additionally, CRD, and as many of you know, and you call us a lot of times for different data requests or different projects, we have subscriptions to several sort of high, they're aggregators, but they're also teams of economists who forecast out labor projections in particular, from MZ Burning Glass, Chimero Jobs EQ, and also the Council for Community and Economic Research, or C2ER. So some of the data from here in the presentation today comes from those sources. All right, so let's start by looking at some national economic indicators. So let's start with some good news. This chart's showing us the annual percent change in gross domestic product from 1980 to 2001. As you can see, this year, 2001, we had the highest percent growth in GDP since 1984, 5.6%, which compares to in 2020 we had a contraction of 3.4% of GDP. So on the whole, last year was a very good year for the U.S. economy. And actually, it's quite an extraordinary year of growth in the U.S. economy. When we look at the percent change in the preceding quarter for GDP, so what I would draw your attention to are the last 4 years. So right over in here, you can see in 2021, we had growth rates that were over 6% in 3 of the 4 quarters, which again is pretty extraordinary for the U.S. economy. But again, it's really a correction from from the numbers we saw in the previous quarter. The 31% decline from the recession, and then the 33% bounce back in quarter 3 of 2020. So let's look at the labor market. I suspect that's what most of you are primarily concerned with or interested in at the current moment. So right before the pandemic, we had 152 million jobs, 152.5 million jobs in the U.S. economy. As of Friday, the new numbers from BLS came out, and I had to update almost of course. As of Friday, the latest numbers from BLS, we're at 150.4 million jobs. So we've roughly, between the pandemic in March 2020 and today, the U.S. economy's regained 20.2 million jobs. Okay, so we're almost back in terms of total jobs to where we were. We're still down roughly about 2.1 million jobs, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that here in a minute. When we look at sort of the monthly rate of job growth, it's been sort of inconsistent. It's averaged about 550,000 jobs per month. And as of February 2022, the number was 678,000 jobs that were added to the U.S. economy. Now, Abby briefly mentioned this, but one of the things that we've seen after the pandemic is quite a bit of churn, is what we call it in the labor market, when people leave for better wages. We see quite a bit of churn in the labor force. So in December of 2021, which is the latest number we have for the good old JOLTS survey, which is what this data comes from BLS, roughly 4.3 million people left their jobs in December of 2021. The record high was in November of about 4.5 million people leaving their jobs. When we look at the percentage of people in the workforce, so the quits rate measures the percentage of overall folks in the economy who are quitting their jobs. We see again record highs here in November of 2021 and September of 2021, where the quits rate hit 3%, which it had never done before in the history of the times the BLS has captured this data. So we're seeing record numbers of people changing jobs. When we look at industry, so these are raw numbers in December. So these are thousands of people who quit their jobs across each of these industry sectors. So again, as most of if you've gone out to eat or your favorite restaurant, is closed on Mondays and Tuesdays, which good luck going out to eat tonight. 823,000 of the jobs that people have were in the accommodation and food service industry. But surprisingly, 776,000 are also in the professional and business service sector, which frankly, that's one of the more surprising numbers I've seen when I've been looking at this. Obviously, retail trade, which I think many of us are familiar with as well, 759,000 people quit those jobs. And then education and health services. So again, this was just in December of 2021. One thing I'll note is that many of the industries that comprise our economy here in Northwest Ohio, so manufacturing, transportation, warehousing, some of those kinds of sectors, actually have less churn in the labor force, and there's a variety of reasons for that, which we'll talk about a little later. When we look at the percentage by industry, so roughly what we're seeing in December was 6.1% of all people who work in accommodation and food services quit. 4.9%, or roughly 5% of people in the trade, in retail trade, quit. Arts, entertainment, recreation as well. And again, you can see for many of the things here, your transportation, warehousing, utilities, manufacturing, we're seeing the quits rates in those industries still high historically, but lower than other industries. So when we look at Ohio, and Ohio is an interesting case. When we look at our state, Initially, our quits rate was not as pronounced as it was nationally until the last month. So what we saw in December, I shouldn't say the last month of the data, in December, we saw Ohio with its record high number of quits. And again, that probably had a lot to do with Omicron, which we'll talk about as well as we go ahead. But I just wanted to show that because, while our quits rate was up 26,000 over November, the U.S. Rate had dropped during that same period. When we look at the quits rate, again, that was 3.1% of all workers in Ohio quit in December, where in the month preceding it was sort of on a downward trend, down to 2.6. So again, interestingly, the U.S. rate fell by 0.1%, while Ohio's quit rate went up by 0.5%. At the same time, we have high quits, okay? So people are leaving. At the same time, employers are not letting anybody go, right? So I guess if you're a bat or a slacker, this is a great time to be an employee. So right now we have record low layoffs, and again, this is because employers obviously don't know where their next worker is going to come from, and so what we're seeing is a level of about 1.1 million layoffs, which is down significantly from the pre-pandemic level of 1.8 million. What this leads to is high job openings, right? So coupled with the demand that Abby mentioned from the pandemic, all of us have a lot more money. We were bored, so we spent a lot of money on durable goods. So we have a tight labor market in the U.S. because of demand, but also people looking for higher wages. So the U.S. Hit its all-time job openings mark in October of over 11 million job openings. That number hasn't really budged. We're still at 10.9 million job openings as of December 2021. I expect those numbers to moderate a bit because Omicron's over, and I think we're finally starting to see some light here. So those numbers in the next couple months of data should get a little better, but it's really hard to say. When we look at job openings by industry, this one surprises me all the time. But so a lot of the narrative has been around accommodation and food services and really some of those industries, but really education and health services are seeing the highest number of job openings in the U.S. economy right now. There's a raw number. So it's something important to keep in mind, obviously, right? A lot of us, in the room, we've sort of known that many of our nurses and healthcare professionals have become burnt out during the pandemic. Also, we know we have an aging society, which I'll talk about a bit more in a bit. And so that's all driving more demand for folks in health. And as we also know, our teachers became very burnt out during the pandemic. Many of them chose different career paths. And so, if you want two industries where there's going to be workforce shortages drastically in the next 5 years, it's teachers and nurses and healthcare professionals. When we look at the job openings rate, and this is what gets a lot of the attention, so this is the percentage of all positions that are open. So 10.2% of all accommodation and food service positions remain unfilled. Transportation and warehousing, again, while we're not seeing, in transportation and warehousing is pretty much all demand driven. Because of the increase in spending and the amount of money that's available. We're seeing that number push up not because people are quitting necessarily, but because there's just more demand now than there ever has been. Professional and business services also around 8%. If you look down at manufacturing, which is obviously very important in our region, that number is hovering around 6.4%. When we look at job openings across the state of Ohio, we hit our record number in December 2021 with 426,000 job openings, which was well above the pre-pandemic level of the monthly number of around 252,000. So, that's roughly, we've had, and since November, when we saw sort of a downward trend, we saw it tick back up by about 22,000 job openings. Again, that has probably a lot to do with the Omicron variant. At the same time, we've seen flat levels of hiring. Right? So people are just not, companies are not able to hire at the pace they would like. So while we've seen increasing levels of job openings, hiring's remained flat since the summer of 2020, with employers hiring roughly 6.2 million people in December of 2021. And while that may sound like a lot, remember that we had 4.3 million people who quit, and then another 1.1 million who were laid off. Back to even our low number of layoffs is still 1.1 million people. So it's really not really putting a dent in the overall number of job openings. So where are all these people going, right? This is the million-dollar question, right? So I have a couple data points that I hope will shed some light on this. One of the things we've seen coming out of the pandemic is we've seen a record number of Americans who are starting their own businesses. You know, Russ Mills or Mike J, LLC, right? That's a nice ring to it, Mike. So we've seen more people creating businesses across the U.S. So 550,000 businesses were started in the U.S. In July of 2020, which was the record number. And that number's remained really high. We're still at 418,000 new businesses that were created in December of 2020. And so that's well above the pre-pandemic levels, which have always hovered around 275,000 or so new businesses per month. So we're seeing a lot of people going to work for themselves. So that flexibility that the pandemic afforded us, and that sort of consideration I mentioned in my opening remarks, has really led people to think that they want to work for themselves. We've also seen higher levels than normal of self-employment. So this measures the number of Americans who work for themselves. So similar to, it's not the same thing as a new business, obviously, but this is the number of people who identify as self-employed. So we're seeing, we had record high number of those folks, and again, July 2021 of 10.2, and that number has remained fairly high. It's starting to tick downward a little bit, which might be a sign that people are returning to the workforce and to traditional jobs as wages increase, which I'll share here in a minute. So what does all this mean? This all means we have the tightest labor market that any of us have ever seen. Right now, there are 0.6 workers per every job opening, so not one, right? And if you recall, before the pandemic, we were in a tight period too. I mean, I remember doing this right before the pandemic in March of 2020, and we were talking about still less than one worker per job opening at that time, because our unemployment rates were the lowest we had ever seen them, and now we've surpassed that even now where we are in the labor force. So wages are rising, right? Abby mentioned this in his presentation. And so the last quarter, 2021, wages rose 4.5% compared to the previous quarter. For those who are switching jobs, and this explains why we're seeing the record number of quits we're seeing, if you quit your job, you're on average going to get a 5.3% wage increase. If you stay in your job, you're going to get roughly a 4.1% wage increase, according to the latest month, or the latest quarter of January of 2022, excuse me. I keep saying 2021, January 2022, so quarter one. So this is really what's incentivizing a lot of people to leave their current jobs and go look for a job elsewhere. What we're also seeing is that wage growth has been faster for lower wage workers. Again, mainly because of the sectors that we're talking about here. So we're talking about the food and accommodation industries. We're talking about transportation and warehousing, right? And the wage growth there has been 5.4%. And then when you compare that, then that's for the lowest quintile of workers. When you go down, right, so the second quintile income level, it's 4.1%. Then overall, we're talking about roughly 3.8%. Previous 12 months, 3.4%. And then if you're in the highest quartile of workers, wage growth has actually been less now than pre-pandemic, which is something important to consider. And I think that has a lot to do with why we're seeing the professional and business services tick up on the quits rate, because those jobs have not seen the wage growth that lower wage positions have. So it's interesting. I just think that really the only positions that have really seen that are folks who are in the lower quartiles of income. We're also seeing that with folks with lower education levels. So if you have a high school degree or less, or excuse me, if you finish high school or less, 4.2% wage growth. Again, if 3.8% if you have the overall rate, 3.7 for those with a bachelor's, and then 3.3 if you have an associate's degree. So what's interesting here is we're talking about, and for those of you who work in producing associates, our colleagues at Owens and and our BGSU Firelands campus, that number is concerning, obviously. But again, I think it has to do with the sectors we're talking about here that folks with an associate's degree work in versus folks that just have completed high school. We're also seeing younger workers see more of the wage growth. So the 16 to 24 bracket has seen wage growth of 10.5%. Again, a lot of that's driven by accommodation, food services, warehousing, et cetera. The mid-range folks, 25 to 54, pretty flat, about 4 percentage points. And then roughly, those who are older have seen wages actually decrease, which is an interesting trend, and we'll talk about the importance of the 55 and older category here in a minute. But the fact that their wages have actually, their wage growth has shrunk is interesting, and an interesting trend. So this is a little hard to see, I know, but this is mainly for the printed version that you all will have afterwards. So what we did here was we plotted wage growth on the y-axis, and on your x on the bottom, we plotted the change in the quits rate. And so the size of the bubble is our overall the size of the bubble is the overall size of the employment in that industry sector. So what we see here is that as the quits rate increased, right? Basically what I'm showing you here is that the quits rates are driving wage growth, right? So the more people are quitting in accommodation and food services, it's causing wages to increase. Okay. One of the exceptions, and again, this really highlights that demand function, is transportation, warehousing, and utilities, right? So their quits rate the change in their quits rate's pretty low, right? Roughly 0.5 percentage point. But again, because of the increase in demand, and also because they're competing with those folks in the accommodation and food services for the same pool of workers typically, that's why we're seeing their wage growth increase drastically as well. And that's why all of our Amazon Prime memberships will be going up this year as well, for those of you who are a member, which is probably most of us. What's allowing this to happen? So I thought this is an important point to make, and Abby sort of highlighted this a bit. So why, and we're seeing inflation, right? So we know that some companies are passing on the cost of these wage increases to us. But I think a lot of people would say that most of those inflationary pressures are actually due to the energy prices, supply chain disruptions, et cetera. And so what I wanted to show you is that companies are able to accommodate this wage growth because they've had record profits. And I just think it's an important point to note. Coming out of the pandemic, corporate profit rates have skyrocketed to all-time highs. So this is measuring total corporate profits, as a function, with their inventory valuation, capital consumption, et cetera. And so I just think it's interesting to show that the pandemic, while initially hurt corporate profits, the amount of stimulus we've had, PPP, the amount of money that was put into consumers' pockets after the pandemic, that's actually drastically increased corporate profits over the same time period. So, what does the future hold in terms of the labor market? Is this a short-term blip, or are we headed to what some people have called a sansdemic, right? And a sansdemic means a world without enough people, or without people. And so I think it's important to sort of ask those questions. So let's talk about the labor force a bit. I know many of you were always very interested in that. So before we do that, I think it's always important to remember sort of how we calculate the labor force rate in the U.S. Right? So in order to be calculated in the labor force, right, you have to be employed but absent due to an illness, right? So you're out sick. You have to be unemployed, but waiting on a layoff recall. So that's pretty common in the sort of the manufacturing space. Or unemployed and actively looking for work within the past 4 weeks. So if you're one of those, you're counted in the labor force. If you're none of them, right, you're not in the labor force, right? So if you're retired, for instance, you're not in the labor force. If you aren't actively looking for work in the past 4 weeks, you're not counted as part of the labor force. So this is the one that I think most of us feel on a daily basis in our region, right? Labor force participation has been declining since even before this chart, right? But 2000 to today, right before the pandemic, our labor force participation rate in the U.S. was 63.4%. During the height of the pandemic, it dropped down to 60.2%. And today we've recovered, and again, that number is of February 2022, actually, that was published the other day, 62.3. So we're getting close, again, to the same labor force participation rate, but we're roughly 1.1 percentage points off. Now remember, and we'll talk about how that's calculated, the labor force participation rate is a function of the number of people who are in the labor force divided by the total number of population, which also has some conflating variables in it in terms of how you actually calculate this. So for me, this is an important chart. So this was the latest available data, and the conference board did a really interesting deep dive into this, where they looked at, okay, so the third quarter of 2019 versus the third quarter of 2021. There were 2.1 million people not working in the third quarter of 2019. There were 6.98 million people not working in the third quarter of 2021. Okay, so when you break out that 6.98 million people who were not working, the difference, 3.58 million of those folks retired, right? They're unlikely to come back to the labor force anytime soon, unless some of the things that Abby talked about in terms of stock prices, housing, and we'll talk about that as well. Right, but those 3.5 million people, I would just consider them out of the labor force for good. Okay. Then we have the folks who we've heard a lot about, so taking care of your house or family, other reasons, parenting with young children, right? That's roughly 750 to 1 million people who are in that bucket. And then we have the folks who do want a job, right? So want a job, but they may not be actively looking now, right? So, or they're unemployed, 1.9 million people. So I just wanted to highlight this because I think it's really important to understand how many people have left the labor force. And on top of that, think of all the number of our friends, community members, et cetera, who passed away during the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you add those things up, it's really no surprise that our labor force has shrunk so rapidly and we're seeing such a tight labor market. This is the key. So what's enabling this, right? The question I always get is, how can people afford not to work? I wonder that myself a lot. But one of the primary reasons folks have been able to retire or exit the labor force is because the U.S. is seeing record levels of net worth and wealth. And this has downstream effects too, which I'll mention. So this is the total net worth divided by the gross domestic product of the U.S. It's a common measure that we use, of all the households in the U.S. divided by GDP to see what the wealth of Americans is. So before the pandemic, we were looking at a rate roughly 5.2%. If you recall, the stock market was still doing pretty well before the pandemic. So right, that's what's driving a lot of this. Same with housing prices. Like that's what most of this wealth is. It's valuation of a home, and it's your stock market portfolio, your 401k portfolio. And so right now that's at 6.24% as a ratio, which is the highest level in the history of the United States. So that wealth has enabled a lot of people to retire and exit the labor market early, particularly if they were concerned about their health or were in a service-facing, public-facing job. So those folks have left the labor market. The downstream consequence is that mom and dad have more money now, and so they can pass some of that on, or grandparents who may be leaving and passing that on to younger generations who may then not have to go out and work that part-time job, who may not have to enter the labor force right away. And so this wealth has an incredible effect on our labor market, and it's something that I don't think has gotten enough attention in the popular press, is how much many of us have seen our bottom lines be better off, that may be affecting how people enter the labor force. So what can we expect in the future? Another common question. So the age pyramid figure here from the U.S. Census, I compared 1990 to 2022. So when you want for a sustainable society is what we have on the left there in 1990. So you have more younger folks who can take care of older folks, right? So that's when you have sustainability in terms of Social Security. You have sustainability in terms of enough labor to care for older folks as they age in place, et cetera. When you look at the 2022 age pyramid, what we see is a very bloated age pyramid, which is always a bad sign if you're a demographer, because what you're seeing here is you have roughly the same number of younger people who are going to have to support and take care of the same number of elderly folks, which poses a lot of challenge in terms of providing resources and also labor to do that as a society. So just from a fundamental societal perspective, this is problematic in the U.S. Couple that with this, and this is a really important point. This isn't going to fix itself anytime soon because our birth rates in the U.S. are at record lows. So this is the total fertility rate of children per woman. That's how they measure it. It's very technical. We hit the last time we were above 2.1, and 2.1 for demographers is an important number because that's the replacement rate for a society. So 2.1 children per family. The last time we hit that was in 2007 for the recession. In the 2008 recession, we're still seeing the effects of that, coupled with the pandemic, right? We're down to 1.64 children per woman in the U.S. This is a systemic problem for us, right? Especially with the baby boomer generation that's retiring now or already has during the pandemic. So what we're looking at here, and I think that's a really important point, is that we're moving towards a world where we're not going to have enough workers for the demand for goods and services that we have, given our wealth levels. And so how do you fix that? Well, you fix that with robotics, automation, which I think we're well positioned to do in this region, obviously. And then, I think through corporate different efficiency strategies. But really, it's a tough situation for us that's not going to fix itself anytime soon. One potential solution is immigration. However, as you know, for a variety of reasons, policy choices, the COVID-19 pandemic, et cetera, this is measuring from DHS, lawful entry, lawful visas for permanent and green cards for permanent residents in the U.S. That number has fallen off a cliff. And I would say birth rates are declining almost in every country around the world. So we're not going to fix it through immigration, but immigration is a temporary patch. And being that we are the United States and have one of the highest standards of living in the world, in theory this should be a place where we would be able to attract workers from other countries. And we've chosen not to do that in the last 4 years. So let's take a dive into our regional economic performance over the last 5 years. So our region at CRD has expanded quite a bit. So we're working all the way down in right outside Columbus, sort of Delaware and Madison County. So what I decided to present today, since we have folks who are online who are watching, that's going to be the region that we use for Northwest Ohio. When I say Northwest Ohio, I know it's a little bit more in Central Ohio than we're typically used to, but that's the 31 county region that we cover now. So I'd like to present the data for that. So when we look, and again, I know this is an eye test, and again, I mainly put these together with the colors so you can see the trends, and then the eye test part will be when you get the PDF. So when we look at job growth across the state over the last 5 years, and so I always use a 5-year time horizon because it sort of gives you a trend. And remember, COVID-19 is a big part of this 5-year trend, right? So we saw a lot of decline in employment during the year of the 2020. But we've really seen limited job growth at the county level, right? As we all know, Licking County is sort of the superstar of the state, and that number's before Intel. So you can imagine what that number will be post-Intel, right? So Licking County is really where most of the job growth in the state of Ohio has been centered, sort of the Columbus suburbs. We've also seen the growth concentrated in Warren County and sort of suburban Cincinnati. Some of the Appalachian counties have actually seen some job growth, again, but that's small scale typically. So again, what I just wanted to highlight here is most of the counties in our state are losing jobs. When we focus in on Northwest Ohio, over that 5-year period, again, most of the counties in our region have lost jobs, with the notable exception of Van Wert, Wyandotte, Madison and Ashland counties. These counties have had relatively small net job growth. And what I mean by when I say net is 2017 compared to 2021. So I would say it's a hard bar to see job growth in that period given the pandemic. I think our counties that are right around sort of a 3 or 4% loss in jobs are probably doing pretty well still. Over that 5-year time period. So what I did here was break it out by manufacturing jobs, okay? And so what I wanted to highlight here is that Lucas County has done exceptionally well in bringing in manufacturing jobs over the last 5 years. So roughly over 3,000 new jobs in manufacturing with a gain of 13.5%. Similarly, Union County, where Honda is located down in Marysville, that county's done well in attracting manufacturing jobs, along with our neighbors in Wyandotte County, who've also had some good projects there over the last 5 years that have really increased their manufacturing employment. When we look at professional, scientific, and technical services, jobs in these industries, unsurprisingly, most of this growth has been sort of concentrated down in the Columbus metro, right? So Delaware County, Hancock County's done exceptionally well too, over this time period. Allen County, Ashland, and then also Union down in the Columbus metro area. So what we're seeing is across the state, we're seeing actually not that big of growth in this area. Again, this is pre-Intel, so hopefully this number, in the scientific services and all that will change over time. But this is what we're seeing now across our region. When we look at transportation and warehousing, unsurprisingly, Wood County jumps out, right? Some of the different projects that have really taken off over the last couple years. Seen a total job growth in this sector of over 1,200 jobs. Union County's also seen some decent growth, in Hancock over 400 jobs in the transportation and warehousing sectors. So Ohio's an interesting case. Our employment numbers are all down, right? But our GRP numbers, or gross regional product numbers, are through the roof, right? So we're producing more things, higher value things, with less people, okay? And so I think that's really one of the comparative advantages of our region, is that we're really good at that. Obviously this one here I just scaled, these are the largest GRP gains over the 5-year period. Now the 5-year periods don't quite match up because the GRP data is a little bit more lagged than the labor market data. So obviously no surprises there. The biggest counties in our state tend to be the biggest contributors to GRP. I would say Butler's one of those exceptions, though, sort of one of those suburban counties down by Cincinnati that overperforms quite a bit. When we zoom in on Northwest Ohio, right, we see that several of our counties have done exceptionally well, Hancock County in particular, with GRP growth of over $1.5 billion in 5 years. Wood County also, with over $500 million in GRP growth over that time period, and then Lucas, obviously, with $1.4 billion. So the key message here is, we're making more and selling more things that are higher value with less people, and that's become a nation. Our region's become, as we've highlighted at past State of the Region conferences, the level of automation in our region is quite exceptional, and so for us that is a growth industry as well. When we look at manufacturing, so I'm breaking out the GRP growth here by sector, by industry sector. We see again Lucas County at $1.32 billion, Union County at $214 million, Hancock County again with gains as well, slight losses in Wood County. When we look at the professional, scientific, and technical services, this is interesting. If you recall, most of, when we looked at job growth, this one was pretty red. When we look at GRP growth, it's pretty blue, which means gains over the 5-year period. So again, we're seeing counties in our region, Allen County in particular, Lucas County, Wood County, doing very well in terms of gross regional product growth in this the professional, scientific, and technical services. When we look at transportation and warehousing, we've seen, and again, this is a really tough one to measure GRP because it's really a service, but again, I still think it's an important metric, particularly for Wood County and Hancock County, where we've seen such drastic growth GRP over the 5-year period. So I gave you sort of the labor market overall, dive into our economic performance. So let's talk about regional workforce and talent attraction. So we obviously just had the 2020 census wrap up. As many of you know, the Midwest and sort of has not seen the level of population growth that many other places around the country have. So over the past 10 years, most of the population growth in the U.S. has been concentrated in the Southeast and the Mountain West. And I'll have some different explanations for that a little bit later. But I think it's important to highlight that the state of Ohio saw an increase of roughly 263,000 people over 10 years. Okay, so roughly 26,000 people per year, or 2.28%, which is pretty low compared to many of the other states around the country. When we look at counties across Ohio with population gains, we see that again most of the growth in population has been concentrated in central Ohio. So Delaware County, Butler County, Butler's in sort of the Cincinnati region, Hamilton, the Cincinnati region, Warren County. These counties are the ones that we've seen really grow and drive most of that 2.2% population growth for the state of Ohio. Across Northwest Ohio, many of our counties have actually, and unsurprisingly to most of you, have seen population decreases. One notable exception is Wood County, with a growth of over 6,700 people, or 5.39% over the last 10 years. But again, most of this growth is really concentrated in Central Ohio and Southwest Ohio. One key contributor to population change is net migration. So, and this is an imperfect metric. So there's two real pots of migration data. This one's through the IRS. So what you're capturing here are people who file tax returns in 1 year in one place, and they move, and then that tax return's filed in another place. Okay, so you're really only capturing people who file tax returns, right? There's a lot of other people who don't, retirees, people who don't work, who may be moving back and forth, who you're not capturing in this. But one of the things you do see is that we are, and again, this was the last year pre-pandemic that we have data from, we were seeing an outward migration of people from Northwest Ohio. Now, I don't know if that's changed after the pandemic, given our cost of living, and some of those pieces. But what we've really seen is a netward outward migration from Northwest Ohio and an inward migration to Central Ohio, right, from outside of the state of Ohio. So this figure shows the unemployment rate in December of 2021 for all counties in the state of Ohio. So in the counties below the statewide unemployment rate of 3.4 are highlighted in blue. And those counties above the statewide average are highlighted in red. Several of the counties with the lowest unemployment rates are in our region. So Mercer County, for instance, Delaware, Putnam, Union, Auglaize, all have unemployment rates below 2.4, which is basically nothing. Basically, there is no unemployment. If you want a job, there's a job. So as we know, unemployment rates often don't tell us the whole story, right? Because there may be plenty of folks who could work who are choosing not to be in the labor force, as we talked about earlier. When we zoom in again, so what I wanted to highlight here is labor force participation rates at the county level. And again, this isn't something that BLS produces, but the Argonne National Laboratory has started producing this number at the county level, which is really helpful. And so this is looking at labor force participation for, this was November, the last data we have. And so again, the blue are those that are above the statewide average of 61.3, and the red are those that are below. So Delaware County, unsurprisingly again, has the highest labor force participation rate in the state at over 73%. Wyandotte also has a rate above 70%. Wyandotte, Putnam, and Mercer counties all have labor force participation rates above 70. The counties with the lowest labor force participation rates in our region are Marion, Crawford, and Richland County, which are all around 51 to 52%. But I think what most of you are interested in is this. What's the change year over year? So what's the change from November of 2020 to November of 2021 been in terms of the labor force? And so what we've seen is very few counties in our region have actually seen an increase in that number, right? So we're seeing across our region less people in each county, except for Erie County. And Erie County's always difficult to forecast because of the seasonality of their jobs. But again, that's another sign. But really what we're seeing is mostly flat to 1 to 2% decreases in the labor force participation rate across counties in Northwest Ohio. All right, so I wanted to end and sort of pivot to what our keynote address and our panelists are going to talk about. So as we know, we love, those of us who love living here, this place is a great place. We have high quality of life, reasonable cost of living in Northwest Ohio. The question is, how do we get people here? And what are some of the barriers that we're facing? So I want to show you this, right? And this isn't a perfect thing, and I know, I was really hesitating about putting this in, but I just think it's an interesting scale to look at because I think it drives a lot of where people are moving today. So this is what's called the Natural Amenities Scale from the USDA. And so this thing measures, topographical variation. It's measuring, proximity to services in cities. It's measuring humidity, climate, all those kind of fun things. And this, those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with a positive natural amenities index. And those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in red are those with sort of a negative, natural amenities index, and those in blue, those with sort or things that are what we would call more attractive places, I guess, with higher scales. Now, most of these things are, I would argue, are things that public policy affects less, right? So for elected officials, it's going to be more difficult to change some of these things, right? You're not going to build a mountain range in Northwest Ohio. But what we're seeing, and I would just have you reflect back or remember back to our census map that I showed earlier. If you look at the Mountain West, I think one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of people move to the Mountain West is natural amenities, right? And so I think that's an interesting thing to keep in mind when we look at the county level breakdown across the U.S. Again, we can see, our region ranks very low on this metric, I would say. And again, I don't think it's a perfect metric in any way, but I think it's something to think about in terms of what an inherent challenge is to our region, perhaps, is that, a lot of people want to see mountains when they look out and work, or they want to, they want to have rivers, and I mean, we have that obviously, but not to the extent that like your Idahos or your Utahs, the places where people are moving in droves, where those happen. And again, I think that's really important, excuse me, also in the era of remote work, where people can choose where they want to live. I think it's something, just for us to recognize that this might be a challenge. What isn't a challenge for us, excuse me, is that, Northwest Ohio enjoys a very low cost of living compared to many regions across the country. This figure highlights the 2021 Council for Community and Economic Research, or C2ER, cost of living index for each of the counties in our, in our region. So the values are indexed to 100. So 100 being the average cost of living for every county in the U.S. If it's below 100, then it means that your cost of living is lower than the U.S. average. If it's above it, it means it's higher. This one's scaled to the Ohio average. The Ohio average is 92.3. So those in red are slightly above the Ohio cost of living index. Those in blue are below it. One of the great things is out of these 29 counties, or out of these 31 counties, 29 have cost of living below the U.S. average, right? So again, really sort of putting some numbers to what we already know, that this is an affordable place to live. It's an affordable place to build a house, for energy costs, et cetera. The only two counties that are above the cost of living index, the nationwide cost of living index, are Hancock and Delaware counties. So again, this is an area of competitive advantage for our region. However, one of the challenges we have is that we have nowhere to put people if they want to take advantage of this cost of living and this quality of life we have in Northwest Ohio. So what I did here was look at from the latest American Community Survey, the homeowner vacancy rate as of 2020. And basically, in some counties, Williams County, Fulton, I don't know, Matt's here, I know, right, we're talking about 0.3 or 0.2, right? These numbers are, that's basically zero, right? So there really is just such a tight housing market in Northwest Ohio that it really makes it difficult for people who might want to relocate here just from a strict housing stock perspective. Another key indicator of quality of life in a region is the degree to which residents are able to live outside of poverty, right? So the degree to which wealth is distributed pretty evenly across the region. So this map highlights the percent of residents in each county that live below the federal poverty level, with counties in red having a poverty rate below the federal poverty level, and counties in blue having one that's below. So sorry, I got that backwards. Red is above the federal poverty rate. Blue is below. What you see in Northwest, sort of across the state is, outside of Appalachia and the Mahoning Valley, over by Youngstown, most of the state has poverty levels that are lower generally than the federal poverty, the federal average for all counties. When we look in Northwest Ohio, obviously Lucas County has a very high poverty rate, over 17%, but most of the other counties around our region actually have relatively low poverty rates, including Union and Delaware, which is 3.75%. Mercer, Auglaize, right around 5.5 or 5.9%. So this indicates that most of we have a region that doesn't have a ton of poverty, except for really in our urban center in Lucas County. So as the COVID pandemic made very clear, access to high quality, reliable, and affordable devices and internet access is critical to a high quality of life. So this figure highlights the percentage of households in each county without internet Now, that's by choice or by lack of access, right? But just the percentage of homes without internet, according to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. If you haven't looked up that, it's different than the FCC maps, right? It's actually much more accurate, it's much more detailed, and I would highly recommend you go to the NTIA if you want pretty good federal data on broadband. So as the figure indicates, most of the counties in our state without internet in the household are in Appalachia and sort of in the Mahoning Valley as well. The lowest number, the lowest county, the percentage of people without internet really is in like Delaware, Warren, again, the sort of affluent suburban communities. Also Wood County here in Northwest Ohio. When we look at Northwest Ohio, I think there were, one of the things that jumped out to me was, right, some of our counties actually have pretty high percentages that, or I should say pretty low percentages of households without internet, right? So Wood County, Hancock, Henry. But then there are certain other counties like Van Wert and Paulding, right, where the numbers are just so high that it makes you think, oh, that's an interesting, why Paulding and not Henry, for instance, right? And so I think those are some of the key things that we need to think about. And I'll end with this. So it's not just about access to internet; it's also about speed. And so this is the from the same NTIA. This is the MLab download speeds for each county in Ohio. And so you can see again the blue is above the statewide average speed, and the counties in red are below the statewide average speed. What's interesting here, I think there's more unique dispersion of fast downloads across the state. I was sort of surprised at just how random this seemed. Again, this isn't my area of expertise, so some of you on the technical side in the room might be able to answer it pretty easily, but I was just surprised at how sort of random the assignment of really fast internet was throughout the state of Ohio. But when we zoom in on Northwest Ohio, right, we see that I think one of the really interesting things when I looked at the statewide map is that the counties in Southwest Ohio, Central Ohio, right around those cores, they have such high, compared to our region, they have such high-speed internet. Even looking at Delaware compared to Wood County, for instance, the speed of the internet there is so much higher than it is here on average. So again, I think something that we need to consider when we're talking about maybe positioning ourselves for a knowledge economy or remote work or some of those things, really looking at these. So that concludes my presentation today. A little bit ahead of schedule. I'm happy to answer, we'll try to answer easy questions that you might have. Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't.
What is the basis for including Madison County in Northwest Ohio when it butts up against Franklin County?
No, that's a great question. So our service area for our grant from EDA covers all the way down there, but I also thought one of the reasons I included it this year was I think it's an interesting comparison to look at Central Ohio compared to us, particularly with the Intel deal and some of these other big projects that are happening. Looking at those counties in comparison with Northwest Ohio, if we're to take advantage of some of these statewide initiatives, I think it only helps us and behooves us to look at sort of those comparison data as well when we're talking about Northwest Ohio, which I would give you geographically. I don't think obviously that Licking County is not Northwest Ohio, neither is Madison, but I think it just given our coverage area and also the fact that provides for an interesting comparison in some of the data, I thought it was a good idea to include it. In the back.
Hi, Ross.
Hey, Chad.
So, looking at the broadband data and the households without internet access, is there any analysis, or is that available? What the cost acceptable internet is?
Yeah, I don't think that was a data point that's available yet. We've actually collected some of that in some of the counties we worked in, doing speed tests and also doing what the monthly bills were. And I would say, we haven't done it in the urban core, but in some of the rural communities, it really is cost prohibitive. So I think cost is a major factor in why some of our counties don't have the higher penetration of households with internet. But I would say I don't have systematic data on that yet, but on the limited times that we've done survey data where we've gotten people to sort of tell us what they're paying in internet, it is, especially in the rural communities, it's pretty high. Challenge that would pay here in Wood County is pretty expensive too compared to other places, around the country. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you're, hopefully it's on. Yeah. When you're looking at statistics like this and you're looking across to Ohio, do you do any analysis of how our area compares to southern Michigan, being such close proximity to us versus, say, Columbus?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, we in a lot of our other work we do. I never put it in this one, but I really probably should. At least putting Monroe and Lenawee County in our analysis to see, how we compare and how their economy, influences ours and vice versa. So yeah, I think that's actually a good suggestion for next year's presentation as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Russ, thanks for your presentation. Early in your presentation, you talked about quit rates in Ohio, and you showed the numbers starting in January 20. My question was, is that for Ohio, is that a new phenomena starting since January 20, or was that a continuing trend from, say, the recession or before that?
Yeah, so we have the quits data goes all the way back prior to the recession, to 2008 and even the 2008 recession and then up till 2020. So yeah, you can look back, but those numbers that we saw in the more recent months are the highest that the quits rate's ever been in the state of Ohio. So the trend, if you look back, the trend's fairly flat in normal times. And then, you'll see the quits rate go really low during like the 2008 recession, for instance, where but then the layoff rate goes up, right? So those two things usually work opposite scales of one another. So yeah, that data goes back pretty far. I just chose to start it in January to sort of give a baseline of where we were before the pandemic, to then look at sort of how it's trended since. But yes, that data goes back quite a bit. Anybody else? Oh, yeah. No, so the quits rate is, yes, people could quit, right, in theory, and just, be out of the labor force. The quits rate is just capturing the raw number of people who left. So it's not looking at the reason why. It's basically there's a couple categories in the JOLTS. It's separations, layoffs, and then quits, right? Like, so people just, quit their jobs to go somewhere else or to retire, etc. But I suspect, and I don't have data on this rate at the moment, but I suspect we've seen a decrease in the retirements versus people looking for higher wages, right? Moving jobs to increase their pay. Any other questions? Well, great. Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a. Oh, thank you. So we're going to take about a 15, 20-minute break to stretch your legs, use the restroom, network with your colleagues. During the break, we're going to be playing two videos from our sponsors, from RGP and from the Toledo Regional Chamber. They're really good videos sort of for our region. And I thought they were pretty good, sort of highlighting some of the promises for our region coming up in the next couple years. I'd like to also thank again RGP and Toledo Regional Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring, and also our gold sponsors, the City of Toledo, Wood County Economic Development Commission, and also the Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority. So again, thank you. We'll reconvene in about 20, 25 minutes. Enjoy your break.
Certainly Northwest Ohio, and Toledo in particular, have always been involved in the automobile industry. And the main reason for that really is our proximity to Detroit. The people here understand how to drive cars, fix cars, build cars. It's part of our DNA, it's part of our heritage. What woke people up and said we need to start paying attention to electric vehicles. Ohio, and Northwest Ohio in particular, is a big producer and supplier of internal combustion engines, transmissions, drivetrains. Should those go away, that would impact our local and regional economy in a severe way. The good news is when we started to talk to companies that are involved in that supply chain, they're already involved. Jeep is going to release an electric Wrangler. I mean, that is the iconic four-wheel drive vehicle. Many other companies are all involved in these new program platforms for OEMs that are really making
if it matters, if it's good, if it's hard to find and worth holding on to, if it's built to last, built on trust, you'll probably find it here. This is a place people choose to call home. I'm talking about talented people who could make it anywhere, yet they choose here. Being here means you have choices, full of opportunities that are well within reach. This is a city born out of innovation. Cutting-edge industries that bleed American ingenuity find their homes here. Manufacturing, bioscience, transportation, higher education, healthcare, alternative energy. We're not just making things, we're making things better.
Got a man on the near side, it's Bruno. 30, he makes the cut and goodbye.
People choose Toledo because they want to be a part of a city where making something means something again. Where artists, inventors, and doers pursue their dreams. Where families come together, a place emboldened by the future. Our footprint may be small, but our heart is big, and it's beating loud. We work hard and we dream big. And when you settle here, you won't have to settle for anything. Because we believe that it matters where you make your living, where you make your home, where you make your life. Make it here. Toledo.
certainly Northwest Ohio, and Toledo in particular, have always been involved in the automobile industry. And the main reason for that really is our proximity to Detroit. The people here understand how to drive cars, fix cars, build cars. It's part of our DNA, it's part of our heritage. What woke people up and said we need to start paying attention to electric vehicles. Ohio, and Northwest Ohio in particular, is a big producer and supplier of internal combustion engines, transmissions, drivetrains. Should those go away, that would impact our local and regional economy in a severe way. The good news is when we started to talk to companies that are involved in that supply chain, they're already involved. Jeep is going to release an electric Wrangler. I mean, that is the iconic four-wheel drive vehicle. Many other companies are all involved in these new program platforms for OEMs that are really making the electric vehicle
If it matters. If it's good. If it's hard to find and worth holding on to. If it's built to last, built on trust. You'll probably find it here. This is a place people choose to call home. I'm talking about talented people, people who could make it anywhere, yet they choose here. Being here means you have choices, full of opportunities that are well within reach. This is a city born out of innovation. Cutting-edge industries that bleed American ingenuity find their homes here. Manufacturing, bioscience, transportation, higher education, healthcare, alternative energy. We're not just making things, we're making things better.
Got a man on the near side, it's Bruno. 30, he makes the cut and goodbye.
People choose Toledo because they want to be a part of a city where making something means something again. Where artists, inventors, and doers pursue their dreams. Where families come together, a place emboldened by the future. Our footprint may be small, but our heart is big, and it's beating loud. We work hard and we dream big. And when you settle here, you won't have to settle for anything. Because we believe that it matters where you make your living, where you make your home, where you make your life. Make it here. Toledo. If it matters. If it's good. If it's hard to find and worth holding on to. If it's built to last, built on trust. You'll probably find it here. This is a place people choose to call home. I'm talking about talented people, people who could make it anywhere, yet they choose here. Being here means you have choices, full of opportunities that are well within reach. This is a city born out of innovation. Cutting-edge industries that bleed American ingenuity find their homes here. Manufacturing, bioscience, transportation, higher education, healthcare, alternative energy. We're not just making things, we're making things better.
Got a man on the near side, it's Bruno. 30, he makes the cut and goodbye.
People choose Toledo because they want to be a part of a city where making something means something again. Where artists, inventors, and doers pursue their dreams. Where families come together, a place emboldened by the future. Our footprint may be small, but our heart is big, and it's beating loud. We work hard and we dream big. And when you settle here, you won't have to settle for anything. Because we believe that it matters where you make your living, where you make your home, where you make your life. Make it here. Toledo.
Folks, if you take your seats, we're going to get started with the second half of our program. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. If everybody could take their seats. Fun times. Great. Well, to introduce our keynote speaker, we have Dean Monsky, who's president and CEO of the Regional Growth Partnership, who I know most of you know. But we got, instead, even somebody better, Mike J. With the Regional Growth Partnership, who will introduce Jennifer Vey from Brookings Metro, our keynote speaker. So if folks could take their seat, I'll invite Mike up to the stage. Mike, thanks.
Good morning, everyone. If you please take your seats, we'll get started with our keynote speaker. My name is Mike J. I'm the Director of Strategic Networks with the Regional Growth Partnership, and good morning. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Jennifer Vey. She is a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution Metropolitan Policy Program and the director of the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings. Her work primarily explores how place-based policies and practices can generate widespread social, economic, and environmental benefits. Jennifer is the author or co-author of dozens of Brookings publications examining the changing place needs for people and for businesses, the implications of these shifts in how we live and work, and how transformative placemaking investments can support the development of more vibrant, connected, and inclusive communities. She also co-edited Retooling for Growth, Building a 21st Century Economy in America's Older Industrial Areas, published by the American Assembly and Brookings Institution Press. Prior to joining Brookings in 2001, Jennifer was a community planning and development specialist at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. She earned a Master's of Planning degree from the University of Virginia and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Geography from Bucknell University. Jennifer lives with her family in Baltimore. Please help me give her a warm Northwest Ohio welcome to Jennifer Vey.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and many thanks to all of you for having me here today. It's actually good to be in front of a live audience. It's been quite some time. This is my first speaking engagement like this for a little over 2 years, actually. Everything else has been online, as we all know, so it's just really a pleasure to be with you all here today. So I'm going to make my remarks today on the concept of transformative placemaking, discussing how and why cities and regions ought to embrace this theory of change in order to expand economic opportunities and advance the overall social and civic well-being of communities. So about 3 years ago, the end of 2018, the Brookings Institution launched the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking, of which I'm the director, with the mission of inspiring public and private and civic sector leaders to really make transformative investments in places that generate widespread social and economic benefits. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about why we established the center and why these reasons, hopefully, might be relevant to you and to your work. So first, while place has always mattered to people and economies, new technologies, new demographic trends, and economic shifts are altering the needs and the demands for place. And we need to better understand these demands and what they might mean for our communities now and in the future. Second, we already know these trends are having a lot of really positive impacts, but those benefits aren't being equally distributed. Rather, the digital economy is leaving too many people and too many places behind. And so that brings me to the third reason why we launched the center. If market and demographic trends are going to work for more people and for more places, then public and private and civic sector leaders need transformative investments in places and in placemaking to be a key part of their solution. So first, we know that new technologies, new demographic trends, and economic shifts are really altering the needs and the demands for place. So a little bit of history. So place, or what we've been calling the hyperlocal in a lot of our work, has always mattered to people and economies in ways that are constantly changing, constantly evolving. So in the 19th century, America's cities grew to become not only centers of commerce and trade, but powerhouses of invention and of industry. And then within these, the needs of consumer serving artisans, of retailers, of big businesses, of small businesses, of workers, all their varying needs really determined where they clustered with one another within those geographies. And that really gave rise to our downtown areas and to our industrial districts. Of course, changed during the 20th century with demands for place just dramatically shifting. The advent of the automobile, coupled with new infrastructure, housing, and land use policies, plus the changing demands of industry itself, led to the move of people and jobs from central cities to greener and often whiter suburban pastures, leaving many urban and actually a lot of rural communities as well behind in economic and fiscal decline. These patterns were then reinforced over time by zoning that segregates and often isolates people by housing type. In fact, the Bass Center just put out some research just about a month or so ago that found that detached single-family homes dominate most neighborhoods in this country, that neighborhoods with less housing diversity have less racial diversity, and that a very large percentage or large number of white people in the US live in suburban communities that are relatively homogeneous, both in the race of their neighbors and the kind of nature, meaning single-family detached homes that they live in. So flash forward to today, and we can see how these changing relationships between place and economy have given us the varied patterns of concentration, of dispersion, and of an economic segregation that largely characterize our landscape today. But, of course, these patterns aren't static. As with past innovations, the Industrial Revolution, the car, today's digital revolution is enabling the creation of new products and services that have the potential to improve our health, our environment, and our overall quality of life. But, as with past innovations, the digital revolution is also causing some very disruptive impacts on our growth and on our development patterns, to which we really just simply need to be paying attention and understand what those patterns are. So first, the desire for greater collaboration among firms and workers, together with the rise in the sharing economy, is causing higher demands for levels of density and proximity that facilitate interaction and exchange of ideas, as well as physical items, from housing, things like Airbnb, to transportation. Think about the patterns that enable things like Lyft or Uber to actually operate. And so while COVID-19 has obviously dampened some of these trends in ways, frankly, we still just can't fully predict, these are broad forces that are really going to outlive the pandemic. So further, as more, and of course with COVID, more shoppers have gone online, the country's retail landscape has just been very dramatically shaken up. But aside from all the rise in e-commerce that we've seen and all the impacts that we've seen from that, the real estate industry is actually really struggling to deliver brick and mortar retail product in the right locations. So many establishments located in auto-centric suburban shopping malls are becoming obsolete and in need of a new purpose. Meanwhile, even though retail in walkable areas is in very high demand, only about 12% of retail product is actually going in those kind of locations. And so all these kind of trends are just going to continue to have a really potent impact on how and where we shop, and of course for employees in a lot of these sectors, in sectors like retail, how and where they work as well. And also, frankly, just how we interact with one another in the public realm. If we're home ordering things online, for example, or in more suburban kind of shopping context, it affects just how we see each other and how we experience our built environment. And then finally, the rise of flexible and remote work that, once again, has been accelerated by our global pandemic, is changing companies' needs for fixed office spaces. So again, while the full implications of these shifts are still kind of a big question mark, we know that these impacts, looking across regions, looking within regions, are really going to have a lot of important impacts in cities as well as suburbs alike. Among other things, a lot of these shifts probably aren't going to bode terribly well for office kind of spaces that are physically isolated, that are located in areas that are hard to access, and basically whose purpose is kind of becoming more obsolete in the modern economy. So at the same time, all these disruptions that we're seeing that are being driven by the digital revolution are being accompanied by some really powerful demographic trends as well that are having their own kind of complementary impacts on place and on our development patterns. So on one hand, you have diversifying populations, growing diversity in the country, changing household structures, things like delaying marriage, having fewer children, having children later, and just increased demands for different types of housing. So all these trends are causing people to want different things out of where they live, out of where they work. A lot of demand for more walkable, for more vibrant communities, and that are going to just continue to accelerate in ways, again, that we don't fully know coming off this pandemic. So all these trends are yielding a lot of positive impacts on the upside. But on the downside, they're really failing to benefit a lot of people and a lot of places. So taken together, these trends are yielding, again, a lot of positive impacts. After decades of continued sprawl and suburban dominance, over the past 30 or so years, most big cities in this country have been experiencing rebounding populations, growing employment, and new public and private sector investments in infrastructure, in real estate, and in placemaking. This growth has been occurring in new or revitalized areas of economic activity throughout our regions, particularly in a lot of our historic downtowns where we saw a fair bit of growth, at least, again, prior to the pandemic. And also, we're seeing the rise of innovation districts where you see research institutions and startups and other kinds of innovative firms clustering and connecting in space. These trends, aside from a lot of this happening in more urbanized areas, are also happening in suburban areas as well, and we're seeing the rise of more mixed use and walkable suburban kind of districts. Indeed, the demand for density has actually been increasing. So telework was growing even before the pandemic, and yet nationwide, jobs, particularly in the information sector, were still physically clustering at an accelerated rate as companies sought to really seek out those benefits of specialized talent and of knowledge spillover. So again, these trends were happening before the pandemic. All those predictions around, once we're all online, people won't want to gather in space anymore. Actually, what we found through our research defied those predictions, and we saw more clustering of activity, particularly in some of your higher end, your information sector jobs. So again, we don't really know fully how COVID's going to impact a lot of these trends over the long term, but we might actually find that increased telework could be an important part of the kind of the flexibility that makes intense clustering more feasible and in some ways more desirable. It just might be happening in different kinds of ways. So just to show you part of this region, not the whole of Northwest Ohio, but we did some work that actually looked at the metro area, or actually 100 metro areas, Toledo area being one of them. So if you take a look at some of these, what we call activity centers, these clusters that I've been talking about in the Toledo area, you can see that downtown Toledo is very much kind of the main core here. You have about one block group, in fact, that has about 30,000 jobs per square mile. And While the downtown isn't particularly dense here by national standards, it is kind of one of your densest parts of the region. And you can see here where some of your other clusters of activity are happening. This is actually kind of hot off the presses. This is research that we've been working on for quite some time. We hope to release the whole body of research sometime in the next month to 6 weeks, I say, if all goes as planned. But what that research is really doing is just this, is it's actually showing across the country in major metro areas where you're seeing activity clusters. So where our primary centers are places where you're seeing a very high percentile of different types of economic and residential assets clustering. Secondary have, not quite as much, but you're still seeing that clustering of activity. And then mono centers are essentially where you have basically one kind of activity. It could be, say, an airport or a giant warehouse district or something else where you have one kind of activity that's driving a lot of jobs. But the point here is to really show where kind of clusters of activity are already happening. And for us, these are some of the places where the promise of transformative placemaking really has the potential to take hold. So why do we care about these patterns of concentration? Well, for one thing, these trends are really important to follow because for cities and for other communities that have been suffering from many years and oftentimes many decades of job and population loss, increasing job density are actually producing some really welcome effects. So research by my team, for example, it's actually part of this same research that led to the map that I showed you earlier, has actually found that metro areas with more job density in their primary activity centers, so where they have a lot of density concentrated in those centers, actually had higher productivity per capita at the metro area level than counterpart kind of places. So again, this tries to answer the question of, all right, we see some of this activity clustering on the landscape. What does it mean? What does it mean for places? And what we're finding in our work is what it means is that it's actually showing that these places are more productive than your more dispersed kind of areas where you have areas with a lot of job dispersal. Evidence also shows that density and proximity can generate more innovation. So going back a couple of years, one of my old colleagues at Brookings, Scott Andes, found that universities that are located in downtown areas actually outpace non-urban universities on a whole range of innovation indicators, from licensing deals to the number of startups that are coming out of those universities. And this might actually help explain why we're seeing advanced industry firms and entrepreneurs increasingly moving to be in the orbit of these kind of universities based on that kind of productivity and all these kind of generative, indicators that we're seeing because of that density and proximity. Finally, Chris Lineberger, along with Tracy Haddon-Lowe, who is actually now on my team, and others have demonstrated that walkable places yield strong premiums in housing and retail and office rents over those in more drivable suburban areas. And this, in turn, can have some pretty significant fiscal impacts on regenerating places and multiple other benefits for people who live and work in these places as well. So, for all these positive effects, we know that the knowledge economy's benefits are very unequal, and they're just leaving far too many people and far too many places behind. So if we look across the country, the digital economy has consistently been rewarding large global centers that are attracting innovative companies and higher educated workers, while many older industrial cities, particularly in the heartland and in the Midwest, as well as in rural towns, are really struggling to keep pace with this level of growth. Brookings research has found that since 2005, only 5 metro areas, Boston, the San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, Seattle, and San Diego, accounted for a full 90% of US growth in innovation sector jobs. At the same time, as we're looking across the country, while downtowns across the country are generally experiencing growth, or at least a lot of them were experiencing growth prior to the pandemic, big city downtowns on the coasts have seen far more growth than a lot of their smaller counterparts, again, in the Midwest and the South, with a few exceptions. For example, Toledo's downtown population actually decreased between 10 and 15% in 3 of the last 4 decades. Its population was kind of flat during the 1990s, losing a total of 34% of its population since 1980. Lucas County as a whole has lost about 7% of its population in the same period, while the metro population has actually remained essentially flat. So the trends here look a little bit different than we're seeing in other large parts of the country, which I think probably aren't terribly surprising to those of you who are from this area. So at the same time, many of these winner-take-most trends are also playing out not just across regions, but are actually playing out within them as well. So recent research by the Economic Innovation Group shows how prosperous areas within metros have been adding for jobs, while communities that were already experiencing disinvestment and decline when we were coming off the last recession are actually continuing just to see decline in their number of businesses. So this is a pretty illustrative chart here where it basically is just showing the prosperous places just keep getting more prosperous within cities and metros, and the other ones just keep declining when it comes to their businesses. So in many regions, these trends are actually reinforcing or just exacerbating the spatial disparities created by decades of housing and of land use policies and practices that devalued, that segregated, and that sometimes actually physically destroyed low-income and particularly minority communities. Meanwhile, in many stronger market areas, low and moderate income residents can just no longer afford to live in a lot of the neighborhoods that are at or near growing job hubs, limiting their ability to physically access employment. So the consequences of this disinvestment have been devastating, with disadvantage concentrating in low-income census tracts. So some other research that my team did about a year or so ago found that nationwide, census tracts with high concentrations of low-income residents had higher share of residents working in service occupations, most of which are low wage, and most of which, of course, were very impacted by COVID-19. They have a larger percentages of households with no internet and a far lower share of homeowners than low need census tracts, which we basically defined as census tracts that aren't designated as high need by any kind of other indices. So we looked across indices, that others have done and kind of put these communities into one category, another high need or low need, and that's how we found these real differences between what's happening in those communities. Low-income neighborhoods also have a disproportionate concentration of Black and Latino residents, while tracts not designated as high need are overwhelmingly white. So these spatial disparities, I think as we all know, were created and reinforced by decades of housing and of land use policies and practices that devalued and segregated and sometimes destroyed communities, particularly those with people that are dominated by people of color. And that's left many people of color, even those with higher incomes, and those families in areas that are not only home to many low-income families, but that often lack the businesses, the services, and then the amenities that are simply enjoyed by other non-high need census tracts. And of course, these are the same businesses and the amenities and the services that also help people access employment, build wealth, and provide spaces for social interaction and for recreation. Okay, so I just sort of went through all these things, all these disparities that we're seeing on the landscape within places. But while all this is happening alongside this, and what's contributing also to some of these spatial patterns and these spatial disparities that we're seeing, is that much of the nation's housing continues to be built in sprawling and autocentric suburbs. So as we saw on the previous slide, both for sale and multi-rental housing demand is extremely, or on a previous slide, is extremely high in walkable urban areas. So a couple slides back, as I was showing those demand functions for office, for retail, for housing in walkable communities, we know that the demand is there, we know that it's strong, but that's simply it's just not where we're building a lot of our housing. And so currently only about 20% of households actually live in walkable communities, but for many people, even if they have the demand, we're not building it, we're not meeting that demand, and so what it's doing is it's forcing people to move outside communities, to move further and further away from a central core, from walkable communities, just to be able to afford a house. And this is particularly true in a lot of our highest cost regions, and that's why when you're seeing the headlines and you're seeing a lot of talk about our housing crisis, even today we saw here where there's some needs for housing, where the demand is not quite keeping up with the supply. What that means then is that people are driving further and further out to be able to afford a place to live. And what that in turn means then is it's also often in some areas of the country pushing people into areas that are more climate vulnerable. So California is a great example. You can see why the threat of fire has risen, partly obviously because of climate change itself and because of those threats, but partly because more people are living in those areas. Because they're being forced to live further and further out. And this is really, in large part, a result of a lot of our land use and our zoning laws that are just constraining that kind of supply. Meanwhile, as all this is happening, and as more people are segregated from one another in space, as they're also, we're continuing to sprawl, what it also means, aside from people are driving more distances, it's creating a lot of heavy fiscal burdens on communities, on regions. And it's also changing our social dynamic as well, as people are sort of locked into their more private spaces and not being able to have those opportunities to interact with other people in the public realm. And that has its own real ramifications, I think, for our country. And I think we're seeing a lot of those fractures today. Okay, so, there we go. So if you put all these trends together, what you have is a lot of places that just aren't working well for a lot of people. And it's leading to widening space inequities that limit the prosperity of entire regions. So this just happens to be Baltimore, where I live. I'm using this as an example because I know it well. But the thing is, this is like most cities around the country, right? Where we have some communities, like in our case, a community called Harbor East, that have seen significant investment in recent decades, such that it's become a very dense, very asset-rich area. It's also one that's not affordable for a lot of people. At the same time, you have places like Sandtown, which was once a very vibrant Black community, but has seen decade over decade of disinvestment, driven by a lot of our policies, and frankly, a lot of racism over time. You can go out west to Cumberland. So this is elsewhere in Maryland. Here's a place where it's a more isolated kind of rural community, once also vibrant in its own right, but is now seeing its own, industry decline and its own economic disadvantage. And you can go out to the suburbs. Using one example, Columbia Gateway outside of Baltimore City, which is a kind of sterile suburban office park that I think is struggling, worrying about its own, will we become obsolete over time? And so that's an example of a place they're trying to make those investments to try to keep up with the times. But in general, it's a place that doesn't actually have a lot of amenities. And so again, the point here isn't to teach you a little bit about Baltimore. The point is saying, if you look across the country, every region, and I'm sure this is no exception, and I'll learn more today as I get to tour around a little bit this afternoon, but all communities have these sorts of places where you're just seeing wide disparities, where you have places that are seeing a lot of investment, very amenity rich, not very affordable, other places that are continuing to decline, often lower income, certainly minority communities, suburban areas with their own struggles, particularly some of these office parks that, particularly post-pandemic, may be becoming more obsolete, as well as a lot of rural communities that are just trying to find, what is our place in the new modern economy? So here's the thing. We have a lot of these challenges, and we have a lot of things that are happening that also are showing some positive trends on the landscape, as I highlighted. But the fact is, when it comes to the challenges, we have a lot of systems that are just too siloed to address them. So it's not working, for example, for economic development to just continue to gloss over, as it often does, place and design and racial equity issues, just like it's not really working for land use planning to continue to create inaccessible, often isolated, auto-dependent communities, or just assume that our economic landscape is static and isn't changing. So what we really need is a more integrated and a more place-centered approach, and that's really what we refer to as transformative placemaking. So the Bass Center is really working to advance the concept of transformative placemaking, which looks a little bit different from past place-centered efforts in a few key ways. First of all, we're focused on a bit of a different scope. Oftentimes when people talk about placemaking, they tend to be talking about maybe a park or a plaza or even a streetscape. Our scope and scale is a little bit different. So when it comes to scope, we're not just focused on investments that yield a higher quality of life, but also those that support regionally significant communities, those kind of activity centers that I showed you on a couple of the other slides that generate broad-based and locally led prosperity. Because of that bigger scope, that's where we need this broader scale. So again, it's not just talking about individual parks or kind of public spaces that need to be reinvigorated, though that's certainly important and part of this. But it's also, again, this broader kind of geography where you actually see economic and physical and civic assets clustering and connecting in space. Finally, aside from this kind of broader scope, this more expansive scale, transformative placemaking is unique in that it's in its integrated and outcome-oriented approach. One focused on creating communities that are economically dynamic, locally empowering and connected, where the built environment is accessible and sustainable, and which are socially and culturally vibrant and inclusive. This holistic vision for places also requires civic engagement and hyperlocal governance that allows workers and residents and businesses and other stakeholders to work together to determine the economic and the built environment and the social environment outcomes that they want to see in their community, and to be able to set a vision for the kind of outcomes they want to see in their community and actually be able to advocate for them, for public sector investments, for example. And this can be done through more formalized kind of governance structures, or sometimes it's just more informal kind of civic engagement that really gives people agency and a voice in their place. So I'll give just a couple examples about, okay, we talk about transformative placemaking. I showed you kind of our outcomes, our four-part outcomes framework. But I just want to give a couple examples of, okay, well, what might this look like in practice? So first, as I said, transformative placemaking nurtures a connected and a creative, dynamic economic ecosystem that's rooted in the assets of local businesses. So one example here is the small town of Wytheville, Virginia, where the town's place governance organization, Downtown Wytheville, Inc., has for several years been making a lot of investments in their downtown, particularly in improving their streetscape, a lot of those kind of placemaking investments. But they've also coupled those investments with a real focus on local businesses and local entrepreneurship. So among other things that they did, with some state funding and in partnership with a bunch of organizations in their town, they actually, several years ago, launched a business competition where they had people come and they pitched their business plans, and then the winners of those competition actually got a whole bunch of benefits in terms of cheap or free rent for a certain period of time and investments to help them drive their business. And so this is just one example of how, when you think about that locally led ecosystem, some of the ways, both by investing in the physical place, but also really working to support small businesses in that place, where you can try to create that more kind of dynamic ecosystem. Oh, go back. Sorry about that. Transformative placemaking also really focuses on the built environment. And so it's really trying to create a more dynamic and accessible and high quality built environment. So an example here is Memphis River Parks. The partnership there focuses on increasing connectivity between the neighborhoods and generating greater neighborhood investment through improvements to a whole series of parks that are along the Mississippi River in that community. And they also just invest in a lot of activities and free programming and other things to bring people together in that space. At the same time, the organization itself actually has tried to really work to embed principles of equity in their own operations. So in terms of contractors and who they hire and for landscaping and other things, and even who are part of their own organization, they've really tried to create more economic opportunities by virtue of investing in this physical space, in the parks, which at the same time, they're also trying to connect for social life. And a big part of this effort, as well as some others around the country that are focused on kind of the civic commons, is really about how do you create those kind of public spaces that bring people together, including people that may not, because of our segregated landscape, may not always have an opportunity to interact with one another. So as I said, transformative placemaking fosters a dynamic social environment, one that's vibrant or aims to be more vibrant and cohesive and reflective really of community culture and community identity. So for example, realizing that residents in the surrounding communities in West Philadelphia weren't actually using a lot of the public spaces that an organization called the University had been investing in, they undertook a whole effort called their Just Spaces Initiative to analyze why this was the case. Why they were seeing people use the spaces, but only some people using the spaces and other people who are right there, right in those neighborhoods, why they weren't coming. So they did a whole very data-driven kind of analysis, spent a lot of time in the spaces to really try to understand, okay, who's here, who's not? If people aren't here, why aren't they here? And then they've created a whole kind of dashboard system and are using that to really drive the kind of activities that they're investing in those spaces with an effort to attract far more people and far more diverse populations of people that are just more representative of the people who live in those surrounding neighborhoods to bring them into those spaces. And then finally, the placemaking encourages robust civic structures, as I explained a little bit. So here's an example in Washington, D.C. of what's called the 11th Street Bridge Park. It's an effort that's led by a local place governance organization. So in this case, this is sort of an example of how you had this very strong governance organization that grew up over this effort to connect a park across the bridge. And over a series of years, they had hundreds of community meetings. They brought tons of people together to really talk about what their aspirations were, what their visions were for this major park project that was to connect two neighborhoods across the river. And then, through those efforts beyond the park itself, they also started to explore other things like business development and workforce development and a whole bunch of other things that were affecting these communities. But they were able to do that because they had this kind of governance structure, this civic structure that gave people a venue through which to voice what they wanted to see in their community and the kind of needs that they had, but also had an organizational structure that could then raise funding, garner support, work with the public sector, work with philanthropy to actually help realize some of that vision. So what I did is I kind of picked 4 examples and kind of teed up a bit how they related to each part of our framework: the economic ecosystem, the built environment, the social environment, and civic structures. But really what the power of transformative placemaking is really meant to be is how all these things integrate with one another and how they all impact one another. So if you take the 11th Street Bridge project, for example, it kind of exemplifies that by virtue of their civic organizing and advocacy, the group was able to expand the scope and the scale of their efforts over time. So they began with a major physical project, the built environment, this bridge across the river that was going to connect 2 very different kind of communities in Washington, D.C. But they were focusing on this physical project in large part as a way to have a more rich social environment, to create green space, to create recreational space, to create the new kind of space that could bring these 2 neighborhoods together in new ways and just create those opportunities for social exchange. At the same time, as I said, when they were going through this project, they realized that there was a lot of other needs in these neighborhoods around business development, around employment, around skills and educational issues. And it was because, by virtue of having this governance structure, that they were then able to develop a plan, an equity plan, to help address all these other issues. So in short, what kind of the point here is around transformative placemaking is that by focusing on outcomes for a community at that hyper-local scale, by focusing on intersectional outcomes for a place, all those connections between different challenges, but also solutions, really become far more apparent than when you're working at a much larger scale. But of course, transformative placemaking isn't going to happen by accident. To deliver the kinds of outcomes that I talked about, leaders need new knowledge, they need new policies and investment strategies, and they need new practices and tools that support better place-led development. So first, transformative placemaking requires that public and private and civic sector leaders have the knowledge about where assets are clustered within regions, that means in urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas, and the varied and unique role that these activity centers play in their regional economies, particularly those areas where assets cluster and connect, but where they have largely gone under-recognized and where they've been undervalued. Second, transformative placemaking requires new land use and infrastructure and economic development policies and investment strategies, from zoning regulations to streetscape improvements to small business assistance that support the growth and development of activity centers instead of continuing to invest in auto-dependent sprawl, fiscally reckless, environmentally challenging sprawl. And then finally, transformative placemaking requires the implementation of new practices and new tools within these activity centers, like some of the kind of practices that I noted on those example slides that are more, so we want these kind of practices that are just simply more responsive to the kind of shifting demands that we're seeing in our landscape in terms of how and where we live and where we work and where we shop and where we recreate, and ultimately to help create more equitable communities that work better for more people and more places in a space of rapid change. So this, in the end of the day, is our theory of change, that by working together to invest in transformative placemaking approaches, public and private and community leaders have an opportunity to build a better post-COVID culture and ensure that our neighborhoods are socially and economically vibrant and inclusive, which in turn can help our cities and our regions to become more economically and fiscally prosperous, more sustainable and more resilient, and to provide greater equity and opportunity for all. So thank you, and I think we have a little bit of time before we bring our panel up to see if any of you have any questions of me, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion. Oh, looks like over here. Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure. So this was a case where they have a local downtown organization, like a Main Street organization, that has a long history of investing in the downtown area of this. It's a pretty small town. But like a lot of smaller towns, they were trying to reinvigorate their business district, their commercial district, and we're trying to focus on new creative ways to do that. So because it's a Main Street district, they do receive some funding from the state, and in this case, they actually got some additional funding through their, I think in Virginia it's called like their Department of Community and Economic Development. And so it was sort of a partnership with the state as well as with some other local organizations in town where they were able to raise some funds. They have a certain amount of money that they're working with just to do their ongoing streetscape kind of improvements and some level of business investment, but they got these additional funds that enabled them to run this kind of competition. To be able to, for the winners, it was a business competition. People came and they kind of pitched their idea for a storefront. And then the winners were able to use, by utilizing that funding that they had from the state, and actually I think from some of the property owners themselves who were able to reduce rents, to allow these businesses to go into the storefronts. And so it was just a creative way to say we want to inject additional life into this downtown area. And so they were able to raise the additional capital from different public and private sources to be able to have that business competition. And with that came some business assistance and some other things to ensure that these businesses could be viable over time. Yeah. I want to say, somebody's going to Google it and then they're going to tell me I'm wrong, but I think it was it's less than 10,000 people. I want to say it's like between 5,000 and 8,000. It's a small place. Something I don't know that off the top of my head, but I could find out for you. We also wrote a blog on it too. If anybody wants some more information, the blog came out a couple of years ago, so keep in mind it was a little pre-pandemic. But if that's something, I can follow up with you and find out exactly what the total investment was. Other questions? Anyone, or should I bring up the panel? All right. So I'd like to have our panelists join me. So we're going to have Seth Baker, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Van Wert County Foundation. Seth, if you want to come up. And Mark Folk, who's the President and CEO of the Arts Commission.
Thank you, Jenna.
Good to see you.
Hi, thank you.
Sure.
Good to see you.
All right. Get comfy here. Great. Well, so glad to have you both up here to talk a bit about your work and how it relates to a lot of what you heard today, I think not just from my presentation, but certainly from those that preceded it, particularly Russell's talking a little bit about the state of the region. So just want to delve in a little bit into the local context and how a lot of this applies to you and your work. So, Mark, we'll start with you. So you focus on enhancing the region's economy and quality of life through the arts. So can you talk a little bit about your organization and particularly about your specific work in communities or at that scale? Just introduce us to what you do.
So the Arts Commission is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a local arts agency. We're the oldest local arts agency in the state of Ohio, founded in 1959. And we exist essentially to inspire a vibrant Toledo and a broader region as well. Mm-hmm. We do that through tactical programming, like public art implementation that's connecting people to place, through youth employment, through our Young Artist at Work program, our creative placemaking program, mm-hmm.
And
then a whole host of other programs like the Art Loop or artist grants or relief grants to really help stabilize the entire cultural ecosystem mm-hmm. In our region. And then on top of that, we advocate for opportunities for economic investment in the overall region, including, like the most recent Rescue Plan Act. Mm-hmm. We were one of 23 organizations in the nation to receive a full $500,000 award from the NEA. And to our rural partners here, $350,000 of that is to be invested in organizations from 15 counties in Northwest Ohio with budgets of less than $300,000. So I just use that as an example of how we really work to support the region. But then going back to that hyper-local focus, we got deeply involved in creative placemaking as we went through the strategic plan for arts and culture for the city in 2015. We were trying to draw in national investment from Kresge and some of the other folks, and the response was, well, we don't support communities that don't have a cultural plan that's formally adopted by their city. Mm-hmm. So we said, okay, we'll go out and build some partnerships and we'll do that planning. And we saw that downtown, uptown areas starting to rebound. And we wanted to take a look at the next tree ring of neighborhoods around downtown, which were largely low-income neighborhoods of color, and ask them what culture meant on their terms mm-hmm. and what place meant on their terms, so we could integrate that into the strategic plan for arts and culture and help build agency for those groups to go out and secure resources. And for, up in that point, diversity really meant how many brown people are in the seat at my event. And, diversity is so much more than that in community. And we wanted to really, take a back seat, be a guest, and find out what community meant to community so we could help build connections around that.
Fabulous, thanks. All righty, Seth, you want to talk a little bit about what you do with the foundation?
Yeah, so I'm the CEO of the Van Wert County Foundation. We've been around since 1925, and we're focused on creating a well-resourced and thriving quality of life for our community. It's a strange world for a community foundation to be in, but we started to really look around at the health of our community and realized that we're giving out just a little over $4 to $5 million in grants and scholarships to in our community, about $1 million in scholarships to students who leave and never come back. And this was pre-recession or pre-COVID, started to really look at, how do we draw back a workforce? And we started to look at the quality of our place. When you drive into the heart and core of our downtown, it's rotted. It's had about 55 years of just major disinvestment. We have a Main Street program who has done a great job of building the toolkit, but by and large, they didn't have the investment resources to preserve our core assets. And so in 2019, the foundation committed to impact investing, and so we shifted some of our assets into starting to acquire buildings and properties in our downtown, and have acquired a little over 50 properties that we intend to pursue mixed-use development. In fact, this week we have a $26 million phase that closes, and so we can get construction going. So we should see just a dramatic change in the quality of our place. And for those of you in the audience, Van Wert is just shy of 11,000 people. The county itself is less than 30,000. And so, we looked at it and said, if we don't do this from within, there is no one else that's waiting out there to come save us as a community. And we want this to be a vibrant place for our kids and our grandkids when they come back and want to put down roots in the community as well.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that that piece of it was a large kind of motivating factor for your investments in place in terms of wanting people to stay or return home, or even attracting people from outside?
Absolutely. The conversation really started from a workforce attraction piece, where if you expect people to come to rural Ohio, what are they coming to? We don't have these great natural amenities that Russ talked about. Mm-hmm. We have, we're an agriculture community. We have a downtown that's rotting out. What are they coming back to? And furthermore, as a community foundation, what do we exist for if no one is in the community anymore? Mm-hmm. And so really it's, invest or be left behind.
Mm-hmm. And how about for you in terms of kind of what most drives a lot of the work you do in terms of your overall kind of mission, particularly the work that focuses on place? Is it a mix kind of equity, but also, for people who are here, an attraction? What kind of is your driving force?
I think it's responsibility, equity, and need. When we began this work, we went through a wholesale collapse of the community development corporations in our community. Mm-hmm. So it went down, I think we were 11 to 13, wow. And we went down to 1. Mm-hmm. And we were, convening, activating vacant building stock. Mm-hmm. And really starting to build the social cohesion that's needed to reconnect and build that energy and vibrancy that get people excited about place and want to be connected to it. I think, as we started to take a deeper dive and really look at the structural issues, and I think that's similar to Van Wert, our neighborhoods have structural issues. They are they were built to serve, manufacturing jobs, low education, good wage and quality of life. And I think it was a 2018 Brookings report that showed that Toledo at that time had the highest ratio of robots to manufacturing workers in the country. So, taking a look at the fact that the places that exist in our community were built in ways that they're not going to be sustained now, we felt a responsibility to bring creativity to those solutions and facilitate the dialogues. You know, we don't have all the resources. We're down in that social sector in your diagram, but we wanted to help build agency for people so we could connect them to the other sectors, so we could ultimately step out of that work and then on the next level, which we're looking at now, which is connectivity between places, which you spoke about a little bit. Yep.
So I would just want to follow up on a couple of things that you said. You talked about, vacant property investment, and in your starting comments, you used words around economic development. So can you talk a little bit to how you see those intersections, or even give some specific examples of where you see a lot of those place investments kind of helping to, drive some level of economic development, but also, create social capacity, all by kind of building, investing in the place, in the built environment, and through the arts.
Yeah, and it's messy. It's messy work sometimes. I think in Toledo, if you look at like a Uptown or well, let me go back. We know that based upon some 2017 data from the Americans for the Arts, I think it was 397 arts-related businesses in Toledo, employing just under 3,000 people. So that's more than Libby Glass and the North Toledo Assembly Plant combined. What we also know is that those businesses can't be automated, right? So by connecting artists and creative entrepreneurs with space, or finding out what they need and building connections to the folks that can help them develop it, then we can start to populate some of the building stock. Then you start to build local creative clusters. Then you see bars and restaurants come back. So, in a very grassroots way, we used to do a thing called Artomatic 419, where we would take over a 20,000 square foot building, fill it up with 600 artists, invite 20,000 people to come down, and then those buildings, one after another, would become populated. And then we would see offshoots of creative businesses opening up and filling vacant spaces throughout the community. And then we took the next step from there and started to do things like art loops, where we would move the public in between those locations and program the spaces in between to help provide employment opportunities for artists and other creatives. And also, I think a big part of this work is teaching people how to use cities again. Is in the rural communities, and so we really use the arts as a flexible, nimble model to be able to activate space, connect people to commerce, and then use all of that towards vibrancy for our city.
Great. So in your work, obviously you're giving out money, right? So what are some of the key lessons or kind of best practices and lessons that you've seen through your work and investments that you've done?
Yeah, so this is very new to us in the transformational placemaking world for Community Foundation. I think we started some conversations about our scholarship funds. I had mentioned that we were paying to have our students leave the community, and so we're diving into how do we change that scholarship program so students go off and learn, and then they come back, and can we pay off their loans once they come back to the community? And then we have to give them this, vibrant place that they're used to when they go away to come back. So for us, it's been it's a big learning curve on just how to rethink what we're doing with our funds and how we're using them effectively. And then also, it helps, just like you said, to have all these connectivity, these partners at the table. Our community and economic development organizations all work so well together and need to for these to be effective.
So when you're talking about getting people to, through the scholarship mechanism, go off and bring them back, which again is both about, I guess, tying it a bit to the scholarship, but giving them a reason to not just have to come back, but want to come back. Do you set metrics? Do you have sort of a goal in mind over 5 or 10 years of what that looks like in terms of,
we will. It's a little loose right now. We know, obviously what our capacity downtown can hold in terms of housing. We know, where our restaurant spaces are going to go. We know we've got to do heavy entrepreneur training. We know that there are industries within our community who are asking for certain workforce numbers to come back. And so, we're just going to have to tie a lot of that together, but we're early on in that yet.
And these are strange times, right? So actually a question for both of you, I'll start with you, Mark, of, all right, so now we've been through 2 years of this global pandemic, which as we all know has disrupted a lot. How has it changed the nature of your work? Did you have to pivot did you have to pivot early on in your work?
Yes.
And then what does it look like kind of over the longer trajectory in terms of what you're seeing on the ground and how it might change, the kind of activities you get involved in?
I mean, yes, we had to pivot immediately.
Yeah.
You know, one of our core philosophies is art is work. So we wanted to ensure that we were continuing to provide artists the opportunity income through our community, and we did that through, you know, grant making, redirecting programmatic dollars to be done in a virtual format, so we can keep our constituency and our creative economy in place. We also focused on continuing to improve the public environment and build space through public art projects, so when we can come out of this moment, the momentum that was there before was sustained, really emphasized and deepened our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and then provided a safe and self-guided experience for people to get out and enjoy the arts. You know, I have, he's not a little kid anymore, he's 15 and as tall as me, but a son. When we travel, we would play the alphabet game, right? We would take turns finding the letters in the car. We worked with a local artist team at Graphite Design and Build to take letters from iconic Toledo brands, past brands, and have those made into large signage letters, and then hid them throughout the downtown, so families could get out and safely go on drives with their kids, and get out in the pandemic and stay connected to the urban fabric. So we didn't disassociate. I think that philosophically, what we're really thinking a lot about is that the role of arts and culture in healing as we come out of the larger collective civic trauma since World War II. And that's a civic trauma for the I. I'm in my house, I have to do this. And then the we, with all of the racial injustice and all the issues that have come up in the last couple years. And we're really focused on how the arts can play a role in that. I think in broader Toledo, organizations are working together better than ever. I know Dave Zink couldn't be with us today from the Metro Parks. I would hold up the Glass City Metro Park, adding 6 miles of trail to both sides of the river, connecting 6 neighborhoods to downtown activity. I feel really positive about where we're going, even though there's a lot of work ahead.
Sure. Do you feel like a lot of the changes that you made, I think one thing in a lot of places that made a lot of kind of positive changes during the pandemic, in part because they had to, whether that was quick public space kind of investments, even outdoor seating, they might have closed down streets, invested in art and other kind of activities. But I think some concern is, can this be sticky over time? I think people came to appreciate a lot of those investments. Do you think that you'll be able to maintain some of those?
Yeah, I do.
Activities?
I think we'll even deepen it. I think that social cohesion and belonging and connection is, it's been so hurt by the pandemic. We've all been separated, that people are hungry to come back out and experience, their civic trauma in civic space together, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think arts and culture are very uniquely positioned to serve community in that way.
Yeah, I obviously couldn't agree more, and I think we've certainly seen a lot of these impacts from the pandemic, no doubt. But even going into the pandemic, I think we sometimes forget about how our land use patterns can create that level of disconnection, right? Because if we're not creating public spaces for people to gather, people spend a lot of time in their private spaces, whether that's a home or a car or kind of an isolated office building. When people were going to isolated office buildings and now getting back to them, that it doesn't necessarily always create a lot of opportunity for exchange. So part of this is, how do we think, very differently about the kind of investments we're making in that physical
If I could
realm?
respond, one of the things we're working on right now, and I'm sorry, but with the University of Toledo, is GIS mapping. We've been working in several central city neighborhoods, but we've been working to GIS map all the parks, all the cultural institutions, all the public art pieces, and really create what we're framing as a culture trail. You know, from the Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo to the Museum of Art, which is effectively East Toledo to Junction. That's about 5 miles. So if we could create flexible routes for investment along those corridors that celebrate that hyper-local identity in each place, over time we'll create those systems of connection through civic space that will help, you know, make it more intuitive to move in a new way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So Seth, how about you? Okay, so the pandemic came. I know, you know, at least even we experienced as being the recipient of philanthropic dollars that everybody was scrambling to say, how do we meet the moment? What did this mean for your foundation?
I think similarly to what he said, you know, we actually were right at the beginning of our process. And so it allowed us time to really just heavily hone in on planning, on putting together the components to launch our project, to build out a downtown development plan, which we didn't have, and then to take it to people, which during a pandemic to try to get public input on and to find where people were was a challenge. But it allowed us time to really plan effectively so we didn't fall on our face when we launched it. So.
Yeah, that's great. So, so one of the questions, and I'll again, this can be for both of you. You know, we use this language around transformative placemaking. Obviously, the language around placemaking has been out there for a long time, but sometimes there's even some pushback against that, right? In terms of what does this mean for the places that are already there, and you know, my response is, well, you know, we care about that. That's our work, and that's how we use the language. But what does it mean, particularly like in the art space, around these concepts of placekeeping, and how are you using the arts to really reflect on culture and identity of places? And I guess I'll start with Mark and then Seth. What does that mean for your own investments in terms of how you're choosing to make some of these investments in place and who you're involving?
So when we started the creative placemaking work, it was coming out of the plan again, and what we had already done was identified cultural centers in the community, or asked, you know, community organizers if they would convene a space if it didn't exist. So in that work alone, we were surfacing what local culture meant on a hyper-local level. And we use, you know, again, I say this, we asked to be a guest first and listened. I didn't participate in any of those conversations. I just sat in the room. And building those relationships really surfaced what was hyper-local, and that's the placekeeping. Those are the assets that you don't want to. I mean, people and relationships and community are the assets that need to be activated, and this is an iterative process. Like, community engagement isn't checking a box. It's about building authentic trust, and that takes about 3 to 5 years by our estimation. And in doing that, you understand and you can help connect to the culture that already exists. And I think that's placekeeping, and that's through investing in people who are the place knowers, right? It's their community. So I just think that's so critical for redevelopment or up-resourcing communities that have structurally been disinvested in. You don't want a homogenized outcome. You know, I went down to Nashville to surprise a friend for a birthday party, and I turned the corner, and for one moment I wasn't sure if I was in Cleveland or Columbus or Nashville, because they're all developing in the same way. And I think placekeeping is about retaining the authenticity of our communities and not racing for the dollar, but really doing it in an intentional way that has a much longer dividend payout.
Sure. And Seth, for you, okay, so this language around the knowers of community. You touched on this a little bit in saying how challenging some of that was, even during the pandemic, of course. But how in your work do you gain that knowledge? What are some of the mechanisms that you use to really engage with community as you're thinking about the kind of work you're doing?
So we have a long-standing history in our community. We know that there is only one Van Wert. That is important to people, that we don't lose our identity as a community. And so through this whole process, that was probably the biggest concern that we heard from folks as we started talking about this project as a community is we don't want to lose who we are. Our project is largely based on historic tax credit. And so that's a huge part, that we're preserving the place that people love. And then arts is a huge component of it as well. We have 2 art organizations that are under the umbrella of the foundation that we immediately brought to the table to help walk us through. And what we heard overwhelmingly is the connectivity that people wanted, especially during the pandemic, which we've already kind of talked about, that people wanted a place to gather and wanted a place to eat outside. And that really showed up strongly in our downtown plan.
So what, as we're hopefully coming, at least for now, off the pandemic and you're looking towards the future, what most worries you about the work? Like what do you feel like might be your biggest challenges in the next few years?
We're kind of doing our work on a good faith effort. You've asked if we have kind of some market data out there, which we've not really done. What we know as a community foundation is that we have acquired our community's problems, and so in the very least, we'll resolve those. I don't really have a doubt that it is, though. I mean, transformational placemaking, brings density to the neighborhoods. It just helps places shine.
Have you gotten any pushback on any of your work or any particular efforts, that where people aren't responsive to some of the things that you might be investing in or focusing on?
Concern over change. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, are we changing? What are we changing? Why are we changing it? Is it introducing something new? And then making sure that we've connected and had other people along with us on our journey, that we're just not making those decisions on our own.
Yep. How about for you, Mark? What worries you in your work, or what challenges do you feel like you might be facing, particularly, just given where we are?
Yeah, I think the sustained health of the arts and culture ecosystem is a big concern for me. We were the first to close, still, last to open. Mask mandates coming off, people are coming back out, but attendance is still muted. There was a huge influx of support, from programs like PPP and CARES Act and the Rescue Plan Act. But when that cascades, what's going to be, the real impact of the pandemic on the sustainability of the cultural nonprofit sector that already functions at incredibly thin margins. I'm concerned, alternately concerned and then not concerned about how people are going to go back out into the public space, and that's a big question mark for me. Previous pre-pandemic models could project attendance at events that would drive organizational revenue, and I just don't know where that's going to play out. And I'm also concerned that we don't drift too far away around diversity, inclusion, access issues that were so predominant last year, that they weren't hot, that they become sticky and become part of cultural values.
Yep.
That's really important, I think, to the economic future of our communities.
Yeah, I think, we do have a lot of, questions and all these impacts. And I know, we're thinking a lot about, of course, this in our own work, and particularly, say, for downtown areas of all sizes, right? That were hit particularly hard in different ways. In some cases, it was retail and restaurant. In other cases, the office market for places, from traditional downtowns with a lot of office. And, I think everybody's asking, what's going to happen. And I think a lot of it is just how we start being more creative and adapt, and not think, all right, how do we just go back to where things were, but realizing the world has changed in some pretty fundamental ways. That particularly with office, for example, people might not be coming downtown every day, 5 days a week. So if that's the case, that means workplaces are going to have to be thinking differently. Organizations and businesses that relied on a lot of that revenue, if public spaces, rely on activity that was coming from office workers, well, what does that look like over time?
Right.
But I think we certainly come down on this was a real moment to start thinking really differently. But I think everybody has to start leaning into the moment to say, all right, how do we not try to go back to where we were, which we know was fraught in so many ways, from an equity standpoint, an environmental standpoint. So how do we use this as a new opportunity? So with that, thinking kind of blue sky, right? What does success look for you? When you think, 15 years down the line, what does Van Wert look like?
Yeah, we're it'll be a dramatically different place here within 5 years. You know, having the transformation of our physical spaces, but I look to, you know, if you want to attract a vibrant workforce, you have to first love yourself first. And as a community, that's what we're doing, is spending some time just loving on ourselves first, and making sure that, you know, hey, if we love our place, then other people will start to say, hey, you've got something cool going on there. We want to come be a part of it. And so, you know, it's going to change dramatically. I can't foretell the future. I know that it's, you know, in 15, 20 years, it'll be dramatically different.
Yeah, I like that about loving yourself. I think the narrative in many ways is important, and it can't be a false narrative. I think people, you know, people get when it's a false narrative, but I think embracing your place and embracing the things that are good about it, even if there are challenges, right? But being able to tell those stories is, you're right, it's going to be hard to have other people want to, well, stay, to come back, or newcomers to come, if the people who are there don't have pride in their place and feel good about it. How about for you, when you think of the arts and culture sector and all the work that you're doing, you know, how does it change this region 15 or 20 years from now, if you were in your ideal world?
Well, it's already changed so much
Yeah.
in the last 15, you know,
Yeah.
or 20 years. So I see it on a pretty amazing growth trajectory. You know, we're more and more nationally recognized for arts and culture. Our museum's always been a globally recognized institution, but the arts and culture community in Toledo is you know, growing and deepening, and it's a way that community is expressing identity that's helped adding to the vibrancy that then ultimately attracts the investment. What I think about the 15 years down in Russ's slide with the topographical preference or environmental preference, I think we're incredibly well positioned with the Great Lakes. You know, and I think if we can maximize our waterways and our natural resources, I think the quality of life in Toledo is going to make it very much a destination. You know, one of the things Dave's been working on at the Metro Parks is to make sure there's a Metro Park within 5 miles of resident in the city of Toledo, and I believe they're very close with the Glass City Riverwalk of completing that goal. So there's a wonderful synergy that's happening here right now that I just think is setting us up for an incredibly successful future.
That's fantastic, and I can sort of hear it in both your voices, you know, that you're obviously really passionate about the work you do, which again, I think when it comes back to that narrative of being able to say, hey, things are here, things are changing, and to invite other people to come along with you in that is really fantastic. So Russell, do we have some time for some Q&A? Okay, great. We'll open it up to all of you to ask questions of any of us.
First of all, nice job. Seth, question for you. How is your organization, actually I have two questions. How is your organization funded?
Yeah, so we're a community foundation. So we're a 501c3. Over time, people have left endowments to us that we've invested, and then we pay out the income through grants and scholarships of those investments.
So you've been in place for quite a while then?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Second question is, and I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but the LifeWise program in Van Wert, would that help you or hurt you, or is it neutral to you?
They actually have an endowment fund with us. It would be neutral to us, but yeah, well loved in our community.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Tremendous panel. My congratulations to all three of you, and Jennifer, a great presentation, and to all of you for your hard work. Before the pandemic, one of the strategies for activating and revitalizing vacant places was pop-up retail, which functions kind of like a farmer's market. It activates space on the weekend for local artists, craftsmen, et cetera, to sell their wares. I'm curious if either of you are utilizing it, and also Jennifer, if you could just comment on what the status is of pop-up retail nationally post-pandemic.
It's alive and well in Van Wert. You know, when we talk about entrepreneurs, that's frequently a great place for them to begin. So we've seen that in some of our vacant spaces where we've opened up the buildings and let our Main Street program operate kind of booth spaces for pop-up events.
Yeah, we're looking at it with fresh eyes around the art loop as we go forward. It's been spread out all over downtown. We're clustering 4 loops this year, 2 in uptown and 2 in downtown, and doing pop-up retail and other artistic activities around those kind of centralized events, so we can increase and cluster the economic impact of these events and the kind of community knowledge of what's there, and then move it off to another location. We're still seeing some of the folks that are in brick and mortars could really benefit from additional vendors in their locations. So we're really trying to just do a call and response and find out what the community needs and make sure our strategies are meeting those needs.
Yeah, I mean, it can certainly be a great strategy. I mean, I think even prior to the pandemic, particularly in areas with high vacancy, those places, particularly where you had a downtown organization or a main street that could kind of operate that kind of process, made it more successful. I think we're also seeing other kinds of, and had been over the last even decade, new kinds of spaces that even have pop-ups within them. So aside from your traditional storefronts, whether that's like food hubs, for example, that are growing up in a lot of communities, or other kind of retail hubs that may have some permanent space within them, but also have some pop-up space for rotating, businesses to come in and out.
Even shared workspaces like co-working.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So you have like the pop-up spaces on kind of the retail side, which can be a great place for people to get their start when they're not quite ready, they can proof of concept, before they can move out. But yeah, certainly we were seeing the rise of all sorts of different co-working spaces, which in some ways it's like, it's not exactly pop-up in the retail sense, but just when we think about just being more creative in some of the real estate. Maker spaces are another one where you're kind of combining a little bit of that, a lot of things together, new opportunities for people to come into spaces as hobbyists, but also where it can help support entrepreneurship. And again, give people kind of a place to get things started.
It provides that density of place where they start to feed off each other with marketing and connectivity and
equipment,
and then they start to gain a following, and it works well together.
Yeah, I know in Baltimore, for example, there's a Made in Baltimore that's kind of used the pop-up shop model from the retail standpoint, but a lot of those products are being made in all sorts of places around the city that have been created over time, shared kitchen spaces, maker spaces, others, so people can kind of get start to be able to make their product and then have an opportunity through a pop-up kind of thing with shared space with other local artisans to then be able to sell their goods. So it's kind of win-win-win all around. Any other questions? Oh, here's another one over here.
Yep. Sure. So we're one of the sub-recipient grant awardees through the National Endowment for the Arts of American Rescue Plan Act dollars. We received $500,000 from the federal government. We're going to make, the application was approved based on $350,000 being available for re-granting out to cultural organizations in the 15 counties of Northwest Ohio, focusing on helping the smaller organizations with budgets of under $300,000. So another $100,000 of that is to employ artists through our programming at the Arts Commission, but from Northwest Ohio, and then the balance is for the administration over the next 2 years. So working right now along with all the other cities that got this award to set up those guidelines so we can launch an application this spring. I would anticipate late April, May is our look right now for that. And that would be across the region. I know your community, Mayor, is in Lucas County. We've also been able to receive, or we've been approved funding through the city and county to help support arts and cultural organizations through their recovery from their Rescue Plan Act dollars. We're still in process of getting those allocations released so we can set those programs up, but there'll be an additional opportunity after that initial one. Yep.
Last questions? Oh.
You look real good.
Yeah, so we were established in 1925. One of the first early community foundations, Cleveland was first, then we were patterned off of them. For about 10, 12 years, we didn't have any funding to our name. I think the late 30s received our first bequest. So someone left us funds. It was a small amount of funds, but we started to invest those. Then over time, just folks left funds to us for either specific organizations or specific purposes or for unrestricted use or for scholarships and whatnot. And that has just kind of slowly grown over time. There was kind of a sleeping period, I think, as a foundation we had to go through as our organization grew, where you can only, as a community foundation, you can only give out a certain percentage of your asset as a public community foundation. And so what really drove our story is, we start to talk about, hey, we're worth maybe around 100 million right now, but we're only giving out 5 million, and the community is asking, what are you doing with the rest of your funds? And so that's when we started to dive in. Can we reinvest our assets and figure out a way to make them work not for Wall Street, but for Main Street and plug them right into the heart and core of our community? And so that's what we're doing. We know that on any given basis, our market fluctuation might be 5 million, give or take, depending on what the quarter is. And so for us, that was our kind of our risk tolerance. And we said, can we carve off $5 million and just chunk it right into our downtown? And so our first phase project that we're about to close on this week, we're going to have just a little over $5 million in investment in it to really kick off a $26 million project in the community. So it's a great way to use your community's assets. And all it is just rethinking how you've done this. You've got this holy asset that's sitting over here. You can never touch it, never use it. Is that really the case, or can you rethink and re-strategize how to make it work for the community?
I'll just add to that quickly. I like this whole rethinking, and we talked a little bit about that. I was at an event actually in Cleveland about a month, 6 weeks ago, and they had a futurist who did sort of opening keynote, and he had this great way of describing that concept of saying, we're at this moment, and when you think about where you want to be, he said, and he even used an example of like brushing your teeth, something really mundane, of saying, if you were going to start from scratch and you had no priors, would you do this the same way? And I think with so many things we probably wouldn't, but we get so rooted into doing things the same way, and there's reasons for that. But I think this is, now's as good a time to start reimagining.
The concept of civic imagination. 2 years ago, we would have never imagined we'd be sitting here. Where do we want to be in 2 years? How do we imagine that, and then how do we move towards it?
Yeah. I think the key takeaway is, obviously, we as a foundation started to go through some major strategic planning work that maybe we hadn't done for decades, and so that drove dramatic change. But I think the big question is, where do you start as a community? And it doesn't matter where you start; just start somewhere, do something, and that's really what we were faced with: is do something.
Completely agree.
Yeah, that's great. Sure.
Last question. I was just curious where you see the future of these lifestyle centers like we are here today at Levis Commons, where you have a big employer and retail and residential all kind of mixed together. How does that impact the redevelopment of more urban areas of downtown? And where do you see the future of places like this? Do you see more of them being built, or just kind of curious of your perspective on that?
I can take a stab at that one. So, I think the places like this or other kind of places where you're seeing, even if it's new development, right, that's being built in a way that's trying to co-locate a lot of different assets together in place. I think we are seeing the rise in that. We certainly were pre-pandemic. And I think, just given some of the economic shifts, demographic shifts, that we know that there's higher demand. And I think it's a good thing. And so if you think about our regions, for so long, we talked about regions from like the center outward, right? From, downtown, obviously these were the places that first developed, downtowns and small agricultural towns, and those were your centers, again, of commerce and of innovation, of industry. And then we started to spread out from those places to create sort of non-places in many ways. Yeah. But I think we're getting to the point to rethink what we kind of use this language around polycentricity, right? That it's not just kind of from the center and outward, but how, where are like nodes across the region that might serve different purposes, right? Some might have been historic places, whether urban or rural, and how do we think about investment over time? But also when we think about new development, where are there opportunities to rethink that as well, and to be creating new kinds of places that have a mix of housing types, that have a mix of retail, that are more walkable. And then in turn, if you think about it kind of in polycentricity or like nodal kind of ways, it also facilitates connectivity between them. Transit access, for example, is a lot easier if you've got nodes of activity. It certainly makes a lot of these kind of place investments easier when there is a place sort of to invest in, right? As well as governance. When we talk about civic engagement and people being involved in their place, it's easier when there's sort of a place that people identify with. And to have some place that people identify with, I think, requires places where people gather, where they know that there's a central point, where people see themselves in it, they see their culture in it, reflected in it. And I think that can certainly happen by reinvesting in existing places, but it also opens up a lot of opportunity to think about new development as well.
I think a lot, not just in the context of development, but this multi-nodal network is one of the big opportunities coming out of the pandemic. I do a weekly Zoom with colleagues up and down the West Coast, and that's where I get my juice from. But the relationship networks and frames, I think for me that's a big thing. This I guess is a little personal, but coming out of the pandemic, that really enriched my thought process and the connectivity. And I think in this area right now, like downtown versus this space, I personally feel we're past the point of those being competitive with each other, and we're on the precipice of a tipping point where more will start to grow in between. So, but I think a lot about the oscillating fan and the rise and fall of shopping malls in our region. And I'm also very curious about what the future looks like.
Yeah, another place to reimagine, as I think we're seeing, around the country. And I think you're right. This isn't about a competitive proposition. I think this is overall regions will be stronger if we're thinking in this ways. But that means we have to enable it too. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, our land use regulations, zoning, don't even allow us to build a lot of these kind of places. And so when
our zoning didn't allow us to go after mixed-use redevelopment in our downtown, so we had to rethink all that.
Yeah, because even for so long, even downtowns, I think particularly places that had seen so much devastation over decades, largely due to suburbanization, the response for a lot of downtowns, even really big cities, was, well, maybe we can try to be more like the suburbs. And I think we learned over time that was not a great strategy. Let the suburbs be the suburbs, and let our urban areas, which aren't monolithic either, right? Even within them, let's let them be who they should be, right? And invest in them. But you've got to enable it through the regulatory structures. All right. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks very much to our two panelists.
Yep.
Again, join me in thanking Jennifer, Seth, and Mark for such a great panel. It was really, really excellent. Well, I hope you all enjoyed today's or this year's State of the Region. As many of you know, we try to use this event to an update on economic conditions in our region over the last year, but then also give you some food for thought and some different strategies and approaches to help revitalize your communities across Northwest Ohio and continue the positive momentum we have in our region at the moment. As you go ahead in that work, always remember that our team here at CRD, we're here to help you and assist and provide capacity in any way we can. That's what we exist to do. So as you go ahead in that work, please feel free to reach out to me and my team. I'd like to thank my team for making this great event a reality every year, and especially, again, Demi, who's around here somewhere. I don't know where she went. Vince and Tom and the team from Marquis and WBGU for making the live stream possible this year, and then also all of our speakers and our sponsors this year. So, again, thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you all next year. Thank you very much.